This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I still remember the moment I decided to visit Lafayette Park at night. I was stressed about an upcoming architecture project, and I needed photos of Detroit's urban landscape to complete my portfolio. The park had a reputation for modern design and interesting layouts, but I'd only been there during the day. I figured a few nighttime shots might add something different to my project. So, I grabbed my camera and tripod one evening, hopped on a bus, and arrived just as the sun dipped below the skyline. It felt calmer than I expected. I saw a few people leaving the area, presumably heading home. Once they cleared out, the place got quiet. Streetlights buzzed overhead. I walked along the paved path, scanning for a good angle on the buildings. The tall windows of nearby towers reflected what was left of the sunlight. I set up my tripod near a bench and started snapping long exposure shots, hoping to catch the outline of the skyscrapers against the darkening sky. After about 20 minutes, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. At first, I assumed it was a stray cat or maybe a person walking behind the trees. I glanced to the side, but nothing was there. I turned back to my camera and adjusted the settings. Then I saw it again, a flicker of motion off to my left. This time, I swung my head around fast. I spotted something tall, almost spindly, retreating behind a trunk. I froze for a moment, trying to piece together what it was. It looked too thin to be a human body. My skin prickled. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, maybe a tree branch swaying. But I decided to move closer. My palms felt sweaty as I gripped my camera. I walked slowly across the grass. The ground was damp in places, and my shoes sank a little with each step. When I got near the tree, I aimed my phone's flashlight. Nothing. Just the rough bark and a scattering of dried leaves. My heart thudded in my chest, but I didn't see any actual person or creature. I moved the light around, but the area was empty. I released a tense breath and stepped away. I returned to my tripod, trying to refocus on my photos. I snapped a few more pictures. The quiet air pressed in on me. Every little sound felt magnified. Rustling leaves, a breeze shifting branches, maybe a far-off siren from somewhere in the city. I swallowed hard and reminded myself that it was just a dark park, and I was alone, which naturally felt eerie. I packed up my tripod, thinking I might go home. Then I noticed another faint movement across the lawn. This time, I lowered my camera and stared intently. A tall shadow seemed to stretch out unnaturally from behind a row of bushes. My pulse quickened. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the streetlights. I even walked around to see if I could spot some shape that would match the silhouette. But the angle didn't match. The shadow was too tall and too narrow, and it moved in a way that didn't track with my own movement. It seemed independent. I felt my throat tighten. I thought about ignoring it and leaving, but a morbid curiosity pushed me forward. I wanted proof for myself that I wasn't seeing things. I lifted my camera and took a few steps in that direction. I raised the viewfinder to my eye, but the lens only showed darkness. The streetlights weren't strong enough to illuminate that corner properly. I switched to a higher ISO setting and took a quick shot. When I checked the preview on the camera's screen, it was grainy and dark. Nothing jumped out at me. I aimed the camera again, but at that moment, I heard a faint shuffling. It was like something sliding across the grass. I turned my head and saw the shadow slip behind a thick cluster of bushes. My breath caught in my throat. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear and walked toward the exit. My pace sped up. I tried to keep calm, but my mind raced. Every step I took, I listened for rustling or scraping sounds behind me. When I reached the edge of the park near the sidewalk, I glanced back. In the dim light, I thought I saw a tall shape gliding between two trees, but I couldn't be sure. My hands shook a bit as I tapped my phone to check the bus schedule. I hated waiting, especially out here, so I decided to call a ride share instead. I spent the entire ride home thinking about what I had seen. It felt unexplainable. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured a long, dark figure creeping up on me from behind the trees. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. The next morning, I tried to review my photos. They were mostly too dark or too grainy to show anything useful. The empty park stretched out in dull shades of green and gray. No sign of anything unusual. A few days later, I dug around online, searching for any mention of strange sightings in Lafayette Park. I stumbled on a local message board where people posted odd experiences. Some folks described seeing shapes or silhouettes after sunset, sometimes near the same area I visited. They called them the stretched shadows. Most threads were short, with only a few posts, but it was enough to confirm I wasn't the only person who saw something. My heart pounded a bit faster reading those accounts. I decided to go back, this time with a friend named Marcus. He was skeptical about any spooky stuff, but he agreed to accompany me for moral support. We arrived just before dark. I guided him to the spot where I'd stood with my camera. He asked me how the shadow looked. I tried to describe its height, how it seemed to have no clear arms or legs, just a tall outline that shifted. He laughed it off, but seemed a little unsettled by my tone. As we walked deeper into the park, the wind picked up. The trees rustled overhead, making a steady whisper. I set up my camera again. Marcus held a flashlight for me. The beams didn't go far because of the thick tree cover. I felt my pulse pounding against my chest. Even though I had company, I kept scanning the area, anxious to see if anything moved. We stayed there for an hour, talking quietly and taking photos. At around 10 o'clock, the park lights flickered. They dimmed for a second, then came back on. Marcus muttered something about old wiring. Suddenly, we both saw a shape dart behind a tree about 30 yards away. It was tall and slim, a dark form with no clear features. I heard Marcus suck in a sharp breath. He switched his flashlight beam to that spot, but we saw only empty grass and the trunk of a large oak. My stomach twisted. I realized I wasn't imagining it after all. Marcus grabbed my arm and whispered if we should leave. I nodded, but something in me wanted to get closer. I'd come this far, and I needed a better look. I tried to take a few steps toward the tree. My hands felt clammy around the camera. My pulse hammered in my ears. I felt half-crazed with a mix of fear and curiosity. Marcus followed, but he stayed a step behind me, shining the flashlight around. As we neared the spot, I caught a glimpse of motion to our right. It was like a black shape slithering across the ground, shifting behind another tree. We both jumped and nearly collided with each other. The flashlight beam shook in Marcus's hand. We approached that second tree, but again, nothing was there when we arrived. No footprints, no clear signs of movement, just a slight shift of leaves on the grass, as if something had passed through in a rush. Marcus breathed heavily, and I heard his voice tremble when he asked, "Did you see that?" I could only nod. My throat felt tight, and my heart felt like it was going to break through my ribs. At that point, we decided to leave. We walked quickly back to the entrance. I glanced over my shoulder now and then, but I didn't see more movement. The tension in my neck and shoulders remained. When we got to the sidewalk, Marcus asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, just freaked out. We didn't talk much as we headed home. I could tell he was unsettled, though he tried to keep a brave face. Back in my apartment, I uploaded the photos we took. Most were too dark to show anything. A few had faint shapes in the background, but it was hard to tell if they were just patches of shadow from the trees. I felt a mixture of frustration and relief. I wanted evidence of what we saw. I also felt glad I didn't have a crystal-clear image of something horrifying that would haunt me. I left them on my memory card and decided not to dwell on them for a while. But the feelings stayed with me. I had a new sense of caution whenever I was outside after dark. The memory of that elongated figure gliding behind the trunk stayed at the front of my mind. My shoulders would tense up if I saw a shape in the corner of my eye. I started skipping late-night photo sessions. I stuck to daytime shoots for my project. I decided the risk wasn't worth it. My body reacted too strongly to that fear. I couldn't concentrate or enjoy the creative process when I felt threatened. I searched more about Lafayette Park sightings. I found a few older reports describing tall, shadow-like figures that seemed to vanish when approached. Some people claimed they were spirits. Others thought they might be illusions created by the lighting and the environment. A few folks wrote about being chased or hearing strange noises, but I didn't experience that, thankfully. My account was enough to put me on edge, though. The more I read, the more I convinced myself I had encountered something not easily explained. To this day, I can't say what those shapes really were. Maybe they were people wearing black, or some unusual trick of the light. But it didn't move like a normal person, and the proportions looked off. There were no distinct arms or legs, just a tall column of darkness that shifted across the ground. It left me with a lingering fear. I had never encountered anything like that in my previous photography outings. Normally, my concerns at night involve potential criminals or stray animals, not eerie silhouettes lurking among the trees. Even now, when friends ask why I avoid nighttime photography, I just say I had a bad experience. If they press me, I mention that I saw unsettling shadows in Lafayette Park. That's usually enough to end the conversation. Some of them think it's a joke. Others say they believe me, but probably assume I'm overreacting. I know what I saw, though, and how it made me feel. I can still remember the prickling sensation on the back of my neck and the heaviness in my chest as I approached the spot where something had just slipped out of sight. I haven't returned to the park after dark since then. I pass by during the day sometimes and see families or joggers enjoying the space. There's no sign of anything unusual in the daylight, but the memory remains vivid. I still dream about that shape sometimes. In my nightmares, it stretches longer and longer, looming behind me while I fumble with my camera. When I wake up, my pulse hammers and sweat coats my forehead. I don't know if those shadows are tied to the city's abandoned buildings or if they're a natural part of the environment. I just know they felt real, and I felt genuine fear. I learned to stick to safer photography times and places. I keep my nighttime ventures to well-lit areas or bigger groups. Whenever I pass Lafayette Park in the late evening, I speed up my walk, keenly aware that I might catch a glimpse of something tall and thin out of the corner of my eye. And that's enough to keep me from wandering there alone after dark. I remember the day I found that antique envelope in my mailbox. It was sealed with a strange wax stamp and looked nothing like modern mail. My first thought was that someone made a mistake. The handwriting on the front was elegant, almost calligraphic, and it simply stated my address. There was no return name or any sign of where it came from. I felt a jolt of curiosity as I took it upstairs to my apartment. I closed my door and sat on the couch, peeling open the seal carefully. Inside, I found a wedding invitation dated 1923. The paper was yellowed and brittle. The names on it were Charlotte and Henry. The address of the wedding venue didn't ring any bells. I checked the date again, thinking it must be a replica or a prop of some sort. But the print and handwriting looked authentic. The corners of the invitation had faded gold edges. I ran my finger over the textured surface and thought how odd it was to receive something like this in the modern day. I looked for any note or explanation, but there was nothing else in the envelope. Just that old invitation. I felt a mild chill. Maybe it was a prank. Still, I couldn't ignore the strange pull I felt to find out more. That night, I did a quick search on my phone about the place listed on the invitation. I found references to a historic building on the outskirts of Denver. It had once belonged to a wealthy family in the early 20th century, but had been abandoned for decades. I also saw mentions of a once grand ballroom that had hosted lavish parties. It matched the general time frame of the invitation. The next day, I took some time off in the afternoon and drove out to the area. I expected maybe a restored property turned into a museum, but instead, I found a decaying structure with broken windows and vines creeping up the walls. The yard was overgrown. The front steps looked warped. I could barely see a door through the tangled mess of branches and weeds. I parked my car across the street and walked up slowly, my heart pounding a bit harder than usual. There was a musty smell in the air, like old wood and damp earth. I tested the door. It opened with a groan. Inside, I saw large, dusty rooms with scuffed hardwood floors. The wallpaper peeled in long strips. Each step I took made a soft creak under my feet. The silence felt thick. I looked around for any sign of life, but everything was still. In the corner of the main foyer, I noticed an old coat rack fallen on its side, the hooks rusted. I felt the hair on my arms rise. Something about the air seemed charged. I pulled out my phone to record a quick video. As soon as I hit record, I realized the place felt colder than it did outside. My breath caught in my throat when I heard a distant sound that resembled light music or conversation. It was so faint, I thought it might be my imagination. I walked toward the sound, stepping carefully on the uneven boards. The corridor opened into a large, shadowy room with a high ceiling. It could have been the ballroom. I stopped near the threshold. The smell of dust and mold was strong. I aimed my phone's flashlight around. Suddenly, I thought I heard faint laughter. I held my breath, listening. It sounded like people chatting, clinking glasses, that kind of background noise you might hear at a party. But there was nobody in sight. I took a few more steps and called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. The laughter faded. My heart started beating faster. My palms got sweaty. I looked back at the entrance, considering leaving, but curiosity kept me going. I walked across the ballroom floor, seeing scattered debris and old furniture draped with tattered cloth. In some places, I saw moss or mildew creeping up the walls. The windows were cracked, letting in narrow beams of light. As I reached the far side, I heard a soft swell of music again. It seemed to come from above. I spotted a grand staircase leading to the second floor. Each step I took made a sharp creak. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The corridor behind me stayed dark. At the top of the stairs, I found a long hallway. Several doors lined each side. Most were closed or blocked by fallen debris. One, though, was partially open, and a dim glow came from inside. I inched toward it, holding my phone in front of me as a makeshift flashlight. The door hinges squeaked when I pushed it wider. I found a large salon with tall windows, though many were boarded up. Dusty tables stood arranged in rows, covered with rotting cloth. The light I had seen seemed to drift around the room, but I couldn't find a clear source. It was as if a faint glow just hovered there, illuminating patches of the floor. My stomach tightened. I tried recording video again, but my phone's screen only showed darkness. I could still hear that faint hum of music, as if a distant gramophone played somewhere. I scanned the area and discovered a small table in the corner, holding a framed photo under a layer of grime. I wiped the glass with my sleeve. The photo showed a young couple in wedding attire. The man wore a formal suit and the woman had a long gown. The edges of the picture were frayed. In neat writing at the bottom, I saw their names, Charlotte and Henry. It matched the invitation I had. In that moment, a wave of quiet fell over the room. The music or murmurs I'd been hearing stopped. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. I realized I was gripping the picture frame so tightly my knuckles were white. I set it down and backed away. The floor creaked under my weight. Then I heard a sudden noise behind me, like a door slamming. My heart jumped. I spun around, but I saw nothing. My flashlight beam roamed across the dusty tables. I took a few deep breaths, telling myself to stay calm. I looked at the phone screen again. It was still recording, but I heard no audio except my own breathing. I wanted to leave, but part of me felt drawn to figure out what was happening. I took one step toward the exit. Immediately, the overhead lights flickered. I hadn't even realized they might still work. They glowed weakly for a second, then popped out. Now the place was darker than before, and my only light came from the phone. I heard a faint shuffle from the hallway. That was enough for me. I turned and hurried back the way I came, trying to keep my flashlight pointed ahead. The corridor felt longer this time. My feet almost slipped on a loose board. When I reached the top of the staircase, I glanced back into the salon. It was pitch black. For just a second, I swore I saw a faint silhouette near the tables, but my nerves were so rattled I couldn't be sure. I made my way down the stairs quickly. The railing wobbled under my hand. At the bottom, the foyer looked darker, and the front door seemed farther away than I remembered. I sprinted across the dusty floor, pushing past a broken chair in my path. Once I reached the door, I had to yank it hard because it was stuck. It finally gave with a scraping sound. I stumbled outside, nearly tripping on the cracked steps. The fresh air hit my face, and I felt my chest loosen. I rushed to my car, hands shaking so bad that I dropped my keys on the pavement. I picked them up, fumbled with the lock, and got inside. My heart raced. My clothes felt damp with sweat. I started the engine and pulled away without looking back. It wasn't until I was a few blocks away that I realized I still had the invitation in my jacket pocket. I retrieved it with trembling fingers. I noticed something odd about the date. Where it once read 1923, it now appeared smudged. The ink looked blurry, like fresh water damage, but I hadn't exposed it to any moisture. My stomach churned. I turned on the overhead light in my car to inspect it more closely. The rest of the text was the same, but the date was no longer readable. I couldn't figure out how that had happened. I felt shaky for the rest of the evening. When I got home, I locked my door and checked the phone footage. All I saw was darkness and my own panicked breathing. No music, no voices, no flickering lights. At the point where I set the phone down to wipe the photo frame, I could hear a faint static, but that was it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe the sound was too quiet to be picked up. but part of me felt unsettled. I hadn't imagined the laughter or the faint echoes of a party. It was real to me in the moment. Since that day, I keep the invitation in a small box on my shelf. Sometimes I look at it, remembering how clearly I saw that date before it blurred. I wonder if Charlotte and Henry ever got married, or if their wedding somehow existed in a different loop of time. The place felt stuck in a distant era. When I think back, I recall the soft glow in that upper salon, the dusty tables set up as though a wedding reception had been planned. I think about how the building went silent the moment I found the photograph. I haven't gone back. I read a few old articles about the family that once owned that estate. There were mentions of a tragic accident, but the details were fuzzy. Some neighbors claimed the place was haunted. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I can't deny what I felt that day. It was more than just a spooky old house. Now, whenever I open that box and see the invitation, I feel a slight tension in my chest. I imagine that building, with its peeling wallpaper and broken windows, sitting alone on the outskirts of the city. I picture a silent party still happening behind those walls, trapped in time. I'm not sure if Charlotte and Henry are part of that permanent celebration, or if they simply left behind an echo. But I can't forget the moment I held their photograph and heard the distant sounds of joy, only for everything to vanish when I realized what I was witnessing. That's why I keep the invitation. It's a reminder that some things don't have neat explanations. I still worry about what might have happened if I stayed longer, but it's just a passing thought. Mostly, I let the memory sit. The invitation is proof I didn't imagine the entire thing. And if I ever doubt myself, I just open the box, run my finger along the worn edges, and remember exactly how the air felt in that abandoned ballroom, as if a crowd had gathered there for a wedding that never quite ended. I arrived in Savannah on a humid afternoon. The sun felt like it was pressing down on me as I walked along the old streets. I had an appointment to photograph the Magnolia Stage, a historic theater that had been closed for decades. My editor told me the building had a lot of history, and a tourism website wanted shots for a feature. I felt excited at first. I loved capturing abandoned places, especially ones with a story behind them. But as soon as I stood outside that crumbling facade, I felt a hint of unease. The entrance, once grand, was boarded up except for a narrow side door someone had pried open for me. The windows were dirty, and I could barely see inside. I stepped through that side door, feeling a rush of stale air that smelled like old ash and damp fabric. The foyer was dark except for strips of light coming through a gap in the boards over the windows. Dust motes floated around, and each step I took echoed. My heartbeat sped up a bit, and I tried to brush off the tension. I had photographed dark, abandoned places before. This was just another job. I set my backpack down, pulled out my camera and a small flashlight, and moved deeper into the foyer. I passed by a row of battered concession stands. Rusted metal containers and broken glass littered the counters. My footsteps crunched over debris. Something shifted in the corner, but when I turned, I realized it was just a piece of paper drifting in the current I had caused. The place was silent, but it felt charged with a strange energy. I took a few shots of the concession area, adjusting the camera's settings to compensate for the low light. The flash revealed peeling paint, graffiti, and broken tiles on the floor. I followed a hallway that led to the main seating area. The double doors were stuck, so I pushed hard with my shoulder until they groaned open. Inside, I saw rows of old seats covered in dust and mold. The ceiling was scarred by an old fire, its beams charred. Holes let in thin slivers of sunlight from above. I moved my flashlight around, catching sight of cobwebs and scattered debris. The air felt heavy. My breathing grew shallow. I shook it off, telling myself I was just not used to the stale air. I positioned my camera to get a wide shot of the stage. The light was poor, so I used a stronger flashlight to brighten the space. The wooden stage looked half rotten. Part of the curtain, burned at the edges, still clung to a rod overhead. I pressed the shutter. In that moment, I heard a distant clapping sound, like an audience applauding in another room. It lasted only a second. My skin prickled. I stood there, listening. It was silent again, except for my own breathing. I told myself it must have been a loose board or a gust of wind. Still, I felt uneasy. I walked down an aisle to get closer to the stage. I checked the seats I passed. Some had collapsed under their own weight, while others were intact but smelled of mildew. The entire place felt soaked in past disasters. I reached the front row, near the pit where the orchestra would have been decades ago. The smell of burned fabric got stronger. I shined my flashlight into the pit. Dusty chairs, bent music stands, and scattered sheets of paper lay on the floor below. My camera beeped as I took more shots. The sound echoed oddly. Then I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around. Near the left-hand curtains, I caught a glimpse of a shape, like a person moving backstage. I held my breath. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a jolt of adrenaline. I expected no answer, and I received none. My heart was pounding, and I told myself it could be an animal or just shadows playing tricks. I turned my focus back to the stage. I planned to climb up and photograph the wings. The steps to the stage were wobbly. Each one creaked under my weight. When I reached the top, the wood felt spongy. I moved carefully, adjusting my balance to avoid a rotten patch. The curtain was stiff with soot. Part of it tore when I tried to slide it aside. Behind it I saw a dim area strewn with props and old set pieces. Everything smelled of neglect. I began taking pictures again. My flash lit up old costumes in a corner. They were scorched and ragged. A broken mannequin stood there, missing an arm. I felt a chill on my neck, which made no sense because the air was stuffy. My hands got clammy around the camera. In the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something pass by. A slender form, dressed in clothes that didn't match the modern day. My pulse hammered. I swung my flashlight, but I only saw darkness and piles of debris. I spotted a narrow hallway behind the stage. This was probably how actors reached the dressing rooms. I decided to check it out. The corridor was tight, with peeling wallpaper and half-broken light fixtures overhead. My flashlight flickered. I banged it against my palm until it steadied. I stepped slowly, shining the light on the floor to avoid nails or fallen beams. My camera hung around my neck, and its weight felt heavier than usual. At the end of the hallway, I found a row of cramped dressing rooms. The doors were either off their hinges or partly rotted. I peered into each one. Broken mirrors, chairs, and tables littered the floors. One dressing room had an old vanity, the mirror cracked in the center. I saw my reflection. My face looked pale. I felt an odd discomfort in my stomach. I took a few photos. The camera's flash bounced off the shards of glass, casting strange patterns on the walls. Then I heard a faint sound, like someone humming. I froze, listening. It came from somewhere deeper in the corridor. I swallowed hard. The hair on my arms stood up. I whispered hello, but no one answered. I followed the sound, moving toward the last room on the left. The door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open, letting my flashlight beam cut through the darkness. It was empty, with a bare floor and a single broken window. The humming stopped abruptly. My chest felt tight. I stepped inside to scan the walls. Old show posters lay crumpled in a corner. They had dates from the early 1950s. I crouched down to read them, but the words were too faded. I took a picture anyway. Then behind me, a floorboard creaked. I whipped around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I saw nothing. My heart thudded in my ears. I left the room, heading back toward the stage. My mind felt scrambled, and my throat was dry. The corridor felt longer on the way back. My flashlight illuminated each step, but I kept checking behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. By the time I reached the stage area, I was breathing harder. I paused, leaning on a broken set piece. Dust coated my hand. I coughed. Then I heard that faint clapping sound again, more distinct this time. A series of sharp claps, like applause from a small crowd. It raised the hairs on my neck. I pressed my lips together, not sure if I was imagining it. I climbed down from the stage and walked to the center aisle, aiming for the exit. My plan was to gather enough pictures and leave. I had no interest in staying 1 minute more. As I reached the seats, I raised my camera for one final wide shot of the entire auditorium. I wanted to capture the decaying grandeur. The flash went off. For a split second, the place lit up. I thought I saw silhouettes in the seats. My heart kicked into overdrive. I blinked, waiting for my vision to adjust, but in the darkness, there was only emptiness. I looked at my camera's preview screen. The image looked fine at first glance, though it was too small to see details. My nerves were already stretched. I headed for the door. Back in the foyer, I caught my breath. I swung my flashlight around to see if the path out was clear. Loose boards and a toppled beam blocked part of the corridor, but I squeezed through. I was trembling. My chest felt tight, and I just wanted fresh air. I pushed open the side door. Bright daylight flooded in. I stepped onto the sidewalk and gasped, relieved to be out of that dusty darkness. My palms were slick with sweat. I lowered myself to a step and tried to calm down. A breeze rustled my hair, and it felt good on my damp skin. I glanced back at the theater's entrance, half expecting to see someone standing there. But it was just a warped door and some broken boards. I decided to check the photos at home. I didn't want to linger anywhere near the Magnolia stage. That night, I uploaded the images to my computer. I sat with my shoulders hunched as I clicked through them. Most showed the same empty rows of seats and scorched walls. But then I noticed something in one photo near the stage. Off to the side, there was a faint blur. It looked vaguely human, wearing something that could have been old-fashioned formal wear. My chest tightened at the sight. I felt short of breath. I zoomed in, but the image pixelated. I could still make out a shape, and it wasn't a trick of the light. In another photo, taken from the back of the auditorium, the seats in the foreground were empty, but the seats in the middle rows had pale shapes that looked like they could be people. It was faint, but I could see outlines. My scalp prickled. I scrolled through more images. In the last photo, the wide shot of the whole auditorium, I spotted a distinct face in the corner. It was blurry, yet the expression seemed pained. Its eyes appeared to be focused on the camera. My stomach lurched, my heart pounded, and I closed the file. I felt shaky all over. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was dust or lens flare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen real figures. I remembered the old stories I'd heard about the fire that killed actors and some audience members. I recalled the humming, the applause, and the glimpses of a person backstage. My skin crawled. I shut down my computer and went to the kitchen, gulping some water to steady my nerves. In the days that followed, I submitted my photos, minus the more unsettling ones. The site published a short piece on the theater's history and used a few of my shots showing the building's exterior and the battered interior. I avoided sharing the images that held those shapes. I couldn't bring myself to deal with the questions they might raise. I told close friends about the feeling I had there, the sounds I heard, but I didn't go into detail about what I'd seen in my photos. Some nights, I dreamed about that figure in formal wear standing behind the curtain, watching me. I woke up with my sheets twisted around me, my heart pounding. I haven't returned to the Magnolia stage. If someone asked me to go back, I'd refuse. I felt something inside that place, something linked to past events that still linger. Even though I tried to keep my visit objective and professional, I left shaken. Sometimes I think about the applause that echoed in that empty hall, the distinct shapes caught in my camera's flash, and the sense of an audience that never truly left. When I walk through Savannah's historic district now, I avoid that street. I can't look at the boarded-up entrance without feeling my stomach clench. I've heard rumors that others have snuck in at night and claimed to hear the same applause, the same phantom murmur of a final show that refuses to end. I don't plan to investigate further. I have my photos, my memories, and the knowledge that something is still performing in that ruined theater, and that's enough for me. I first arrived in Monterey on a sunny afternoon. I had rented a small house close to the water, a place where I could step onto the sand before sunrise if I wanted. I had a loose plan for my time there: walk along the shore at dawn, explore the local shops, and watch the waves in the evenings. I liked the salt air on my face, and I wanted a break from my busy life back home. The cottage was modest, with 2 bedrooms and a small porch. The paint on the outside was peeling, but the interior felt cozy. After unpacking, I went straight to the beach, curious about the scenery. The beach itself was wide, and the sand sloped gently toward the ocean. The wind was mild, carrying the smell of seaweed. I took off my shoes and let the cool water lap at my toes. Everything felt peaceful, and I believed I had made the right choice coming here. I stayed until dusk, walking along the waterline, watching seagulls wheel overhead. Later that night, I stood on the small balcony attached to my rental, gazing at the moonlight shimmering over the sea. The waves rolled in a steady rhythm. Then I heard something that made my heart skip a beat, a faint melody, like voices singing. I leaned forward, straining to listen. It was barely audible under the sound of surf, but it sounded like a distant chorus. I tried to figure out if it was coming from a nearby house, but I saw no other lights. The shoreline was mostly dark. The singing faded within a few moments. I brushed it off as an overactive imagination, perhaps caused by the wind or the waves themselves. The next morning, I woke up early, grabbed a light jacket, and walked down to the beach. The tide was low, leaving patches of wet sand. I didn't hear anything unusual. I met a couple of fishermen who greeted me kindly, and we chatted about the area. When I asked if they'd ever heard strange singing or chanting near the shore, they just shrugged and mentioned old folk tales about sea creatures and lost sailors. I smiled politely, assuming it was just local lore. I spent the day strolling through the town, looking at storefronts, sampling clam chowder, and feeling relaxed. That evening, I set a small fire pit on the beach near my cottage and sat under a blanket, sipping tea. The sky was a soft purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. I stared at the darkening ocean and once again heard the faint singing. My pulse quickened, I paused, holding my breath. The sound was melodic, like a group of voices blending together. It didn't sound random. It had a pattern, as if it were an actual song. My skin prickled with tension. I stood up, trying to see if there was any boat or group of people. I saw nothing. The beach was empty except for me. Eventually the singing stopped, and the steady roar of the waves took over. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. On the third night, I decided to sit on the sand after sunset, determined to figure out the source of that singing. I had a flashlight and a small thermos of coffee. The moon was bright, reflecting on the ocean's surface. After half an hour, I heard it again, a soft, eerie melody drifting across the water. I got to my feet, scanning the shoreline with the flashlight. No one. The waves glowed faintly under the moonlight, but there was no sign of any person in the water. The singing called to me, and I felt an odd tug in my chest, like I was meant to move closer. My heart pounded. I walked to the edge of the tide, letting the water wash over my ankles. The singing grew louder. My mind raced. I felt an urge to wade in deeper, but caution held me back. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Only the rolling waves remained. My heart was still hammering. My hands trembled as I turned off the flashlight and walked back to my cottage. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts buzzed. Where was that sound coming from? And why did it feel like it was directed at me? The next day, I asked my friend Dean to join me for a night picnic on the beach. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I said we could hang out, enjoy the view, and maybe he'd hear something too. That evening, we sat on a blanket, sipping coffee and talking casually. When night fell, I tensed, waiting. Time passed. Dean seemed relaxed, checking his phone, pointing out constellations. Eventually, I heard the faint chanting again. My breath caught. I looked at Dean. He just smiled, not reacting to anything. "Don't you hear that?" I said quietly. "Hear what?" he replied, looking at me with mild confusion. "That singing, right there." I could still hear it, soft but insistent. He narrowed his eyes and tilted his head. "I just hear waves. That's it. You okay?" I felt my cheeks go hot. I nodded, frustrated. "I'm fine. It's probably my imagination." I knew it wasn't in my head. It was definitely there, but apparently only I could hear it. After a few minutes, the singing died away, and we turned back to small talk. Inside, I felt anxious. Something was going on that made no sense to me. The next night, I found myself woken up by a dream just before dawn. In the dream, I stood waist-deep in the ocean, hearing a female voice call my name. She kept telling me to come closer. I woke up with my heart racing, my skin clammy. I went to the porch to get some fresh air. Sure enough, I heard the chanting again, drifting through the darkness. This time, it was a single voice, not a choir. It sounded like it was singing in a language I didn't recognize. My stomach twisted. I stepped off the porch and onto the sand, not even bothering to grab a coat. The air felt cold. I approached the water, letting the surf crash around my feet. I stared into the dark waves. My chest tightened with a weird combination of fear and longing. A sudden wave rolled in stronger than the rest, soaking me up to my knees. I stumbled back, coughing as I inhaled a bit of salt water. The singing cut off at once, leaving me disoriented and shivering. I spent the next day feeling on edge. I kept replaying the dream. I had a sense that something wanted me to go into the water, but I wasn't sure why. By that afternoon, I decided to stay indoors that evening, planning to shut the curtains and block out the sound if it returned. However, around midnight, the chanting started again. This time, it felt louder, as if it was right outside my window. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear my pulse in my ears. My legs felt weak as I moved to the window, parting the curtain. All I saw was the moonlit beach, empty and still. But the chanting rang in my ears, and it felt like it was directed right at me. I tried covering my ears. I still heard it. I turned on the TV to drown it out. The melody persisted underneath the noise. Eventually, I broke down. I dashed outside barefoot onto the sand. My mind was spinning, and my breathing was shallow. I shouted, "What do you want?" But there was no answer. The chanting just lingered, wordless and hypnotic. I stepped to the water again. A wave rushed over my feet, colder than before. My skin broke out in goosebumps. Then, in the shallow water, I saw a flicker of greenish light. It glowed for a second, then vanished. The chanting halted. My body trembled. I turned and ran back to the cottage, locking the door behind me. The next day, I found an excuse to visit a local fisherman's shop. The owner was an older man named Stu. I mentioned weird noises on the beach at night. He just shrugged and said some people speak of old myths. He referred to them as tall tales about spirits in the water or lost voices of the sea. I left feeling unsatisfied. I needed answers, but no one seemed to believe me or have concrete information. On my last night in Monterey, I decided I had to face this phenomenon directly. I sat on a large piece of driftwood, scanning the horizon. The moon was nearly full, casting a bright glow. The sea looked calm. At around midnight, the chanting began. My chest tightened again, but I forced myself to stand and walk toward the water. The sound grew richer, like multiple voices overlapping. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stepped into the surf, letting it flow around my calves. A sudden brightness caught my eye. A faint glow appeared under the surface, swirling gently with the current. It reminded me of algae or phosphorescence, but more focused, like a single point of light. My heart pounded. The chanting enveloped me. I moved one step farther. The water reached my knees. My breathing felt shallow. My limbs trembled. I had a sudden fear of being pulled under. The chanting got louder, as if it were echoing in my head. Then a wave, taller than the rest, crashed into me. I stumbled and nearly fell. The glow vanished. The chanting cut off abruptly. I sputtered and gasped, regaining my balance. Salt water stung my eyes, and my clothes clung to me. I turned, half expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was there. After that moment, the beach went silent aside from the usual sound of waves. I staggered out of the water, breathing hard. My heart felt like it would burst. I grabbed my backpack from the sand, noticing my hands were shaking. Then I hurried back inside, shutting the door with a loud thud. I woke at dawn, feeling wiped out, like I hadn't slept at all. The ocean looked peaceful from my window, no chanting, no lights. My body ached from tension. I spent the morning packing. I felt torn about leaving, but I couldn't take another night of that unexplainable sound. Before I left, I walked the beach one last time in daylight. Everything felt normal. Seagulls hovered, surfers paddled out past the breakers, and families strolled along the shore. A part of me thought maybe I had imagined everything, yet I knew what I heard and experienced. My skin still prickled at the memory. That afternoon, I drove away from Monterey. In the rearview mirror, I saw the ocean stretching out under a clear sky. My hands were still tense on the wheel. I wondered if anyone else would ever hear that chanting. I suspected it might lure someone deeper into the water if they listened too closely. Even now, I sometimes wake at night, hearing faint echoes of that melody in my mind. I remember the cold shock of the waves and that glow beneath the surface. I haven't told many people. Most wouldn't believe me, but I remain convinced that something out there calls certain people, drawing them toward the ocean at night. I was lucky to walk away, and I don't plan to go back to Monterey anytime soon. I arrived at the Carter Ranch in Bozeman on a Monday morning. I had been hired to sort and catalog items in an old barn on the property. The assignment felt routine, and I expected a dusty workspace, maybe a few cobwebs. The place was known to be abandoned, though the owners had contacted me through a real estate agent. The ranch had belonged to a family that left without explanation years ago. My instructions were simple: spend a few days examining everything in the barn and make a detailed inventory. I parked near a gate that was barely standing. The wooden fence around the yard had rotted in many places. I saw a 2-story house in the distance, and next to it stood the old barn. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air. I walked up to the barn's double doors. They creaked when I pulled them open. Dust floated in the light, and I noticed a musty smell. The main interior was large, with old farm tools scattered around. I saw several crates stacked along the walls, some sealed, others partially open. I checked my phone for reception. The signal was weak. I had a feeling I'd be on my own here. I set up a folding table in a corner to serve as my workspace. I opened my laptop to start taking notes. The barn felt still, but not peaceful. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't pinpoint why. I told myself it was just my imagination. I focused on the items in front of me: rusted tools, broken harnesses, and a few old ledgers with handwritten entries about the ranch's finances. After a few hours, I noticed the sun dipping lower. The agent had given me a key to the main house, but he'd warned me the place had no electricity or running water. I had planned to drive back to town for the night, but I wanted to finish more work before leaving. As the daylight faded, I started to hear faint sounds. They were distant, like a horse whinnying somewhere out in the fields. It was strange, because I'd been told the property had no horses left. I paused, listened for a moment, then went back to my crates. The noise happened again. This time, it sounded like a horse exhaling or snorting. I felt uneasy. I stepped outside to check, but I saw no animals. The land stretched out, empty. I shrugged it off and returned to my sorting. I didn't want to leave tasks halfway done. By the time I finished for the evening, the sun had almost set. I locked up the barn and started walking back to my car. I heard a short burst of what could have been a neigh. It echoed from the barn area. I turned around quickly. The doors were still locked and the yard was empty. My heart sped up, but I shook my head and kept walking. I drove to the nearest motel and tried to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds. The next day, I arrived earlier, determined to make progress. I spread out some tarps, set aside several labeled boxes, and began cataloging again. Around midday, I found a metal trunk under a collapsed shelf. It was locked, but the latch had rusted. I managed to pry it open. Inside, there were letters and a journal that belonged to the previous owner. The handwriting described life on the ranch, day-to-day chores, details about a beloved horse, and hints of some calamity. One page mentioned a horse's death in an accident. Another page had references to odd occurrences afterward, like the sound of hooves at night. My stomach knotted. I remembered the noise from the night before. I tried to ignore that feeling and continued working. The day passed without incident. Late in the afternoon, I took a break outside. The sun was bright, and the air felt warmer. I walked around the property to see if I could find any signs of animals. The ground near the barn had patches of old mud. I saw no fresh hoof prints. The silence was uncomfortable. I wondered if I should ask the real estate agent about the property's history, but I decided I could handle it myself. I went back inside to organize more crates. At sunset, the atmosphere in the barn changed. The corners of the barn felt darker, and I noticed a slight echo with every step. I heard a noise overhead, like something tapping on the rafters. I pointed my flashlight upward, but I didn't see birds or bats. Then I heard a soft thud from behind me. I spun around, shining the light across the floor. Again, nothing. My pulse quickened. I knew it might be rodents or the old beams settling, but the sounds felt deliberate, like footsteps. I told myself I was spooking myself. I packed my things and decided not to stay late again. As I locked up, I heard a squeal. It was similar to a horse's distressed call. I paused, heart pounding. The noise faded quickly. I rushed to my car and drove off, feeling uneasy. I tried to calm down by listening to the radio, but I kept thinking about those noises. On my third day, I arrived mid-morning. I wanted to work only in daylight to avoid that tense feeling. I brought some coffee and tried to maintain focus. I opened more boxes. Most had old tools, ropes, and random broken equipment. By early afternoon, I found a crate marked with the ranch's name. Inside, I discovered more papers, records of a fire. According to some letters, a barn fire had broken out years ago. The owners had tried to save their favorite horse, but something had gone wrong. The horse had panicked and trampled one of them. No one wrote the full story, but I got the idea that the incident was traumatic enough for the family to abandon the property soon afterward. The entries unsettled me. They described a horse that became uncontrollable after the fire. There were notes about its aggressive behavior and strange injuries that no one could explain. I felt a chill. I took photos of the documents, planning to show them to the agent. By then I was tense, and every little sound made me jump. Even the wind outside felt ominous. Later that afternoon, I closed the barn doors to reduce glare and used a work lamp for better visibility on the crates. The interior grew dimmer. I heard soft tapping again, like hooves on wood. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, but then I heard a short burst of movement, like a quick scrape on the barn floor behind me. I stood up, heart thudding, and scanned the area with my flashlight. I found nothing. My breathing became shallow. I felt watched, even though I was alone. A few minutes later, I caught a glimpse of movement through a gap in the barn boards. It looked like a gray shape passing by. I moved to the window opening. Outside, I saw a cloud of dust near the side of the barn. It faded quickly. I walked out cautiously. I found fresh hoof prints in the dirt. They led a few yards away, then disappeared. The tracks ended abruptly, as if the animal vanished. I felt shaky. My instincts told me this wasn't a normal situation. I finished out the day in a hurry, labeling everything I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a horse appear. I heard a faint scraping sound near the far end of the barn, but I couldn't locate it. When evening approached, I decided I wasn't staying a minute longer. I locked up and left. That night, I barely slept at my motel. My mind replayed the noise, the tracks, the letters about the fire. On the fourth day, I arrived with the goal of finishing as quickly as possible. I figured I could do the work in broad daylight and leave before dusk. I avoided looking at the corners of the barn. I kept my focus on the items and documents. I found more references to the fire and the horse's death. The family's notes suggested the horse lost its mind in the blaze. One letter hinted at the horse attacking the owner, who later died from injuries. I felt tense reading these. The pages described a series of odd events afterward: barn doors slamming on their own, phantom hoofbeats, and sightings of a gray horse in the fields. The letters ended abruptly, with no explanation. I realized that must have been when the family left. As the afternoon wore on, a sense of dread settled over me. I heard faint sounds of movement in the loft overhead. I climbed the ladder to check. The beams were rotting, and I didn't see any animals or signs of a nest. When I climbed back down, I heard a hoof-like clang on the wooden boards, followed by a quick shuffle. My skin went cold. I stood still, flashlight in hand, scanning the floor. Again, nothing visible. An hour later, I decided I had enough documentation. I closed the boxes and sealed them up for shipping. I stacked them in a corner near the exit. I checked my watch and saw it was only mid-afternoon, but the sky outside looked darker. Clouds had rolled in, and the wind picked up. The barn doors rattled. I was determined to get out before anything else happened. As I stepped outside with the last box, I saw dust swirling near the barn's side wall. I thought I caught a silhouette of a horse in that dust cloud. It seemed to stand there for a split second. Then it vanished. I dropped the box. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy. I walked forward, trying to see if there was any actual animal. There were hoof prints in the dirt, fresh again, leading nowhere. My body shook with fear. I picked up the box, loaded it into my trunk, and hurried back to lock the barn. Before I left, I took one last look around inside. The space seemed quiet, but I had the strong sensation that something was still there, watching from the shadows. My breathing was fast. I forced myself to walk toward the exit. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard a single thud from inside, like a hoof striking wood. I didn't open the door again. I left immediately. I drove straight to the agent's office and handed him my report. I mentioned the odd noises and the footprints. He looked uncomfortable. He said he'd heard rumors about the ranch being haunted, but he didn't think it was serious. He thanked me for the inventory and said he'd forward it to the owners. I didn't press for details. I wanted to forget the place. Since then, I've tried to explain it away. I think about echoes or animals wandering by, but I can't ignore the fresh hoof prints that ended out of nowhere, and I can't ignore the feeling I got inside that barn. I still recall the horse sounds, the tapping on the rafters, and that glimpse of a gray shape. It felt unnatural, and it still troubles me. I completed my contract. I got paid. But I'm left with a persistent unease. The Carter Ranch remains out there, empty. The documents I found point to a tragedy, and it seems like the memory of that event continues. When I close my eyes, I recall the dusty interior, the random knocks, and the faint echo of hooves. That's all I know. I don't plan to visit again. If someone else takes on a job at that barn, they can discover for themselves what lingers there. I, for one, am done. I have no intention of stepping foot on that property again. I arrived at my grandmother's house in Tampa a week after her funeral. I held the keys she'd left me, unsure about my next steps. The house looked worn, with peeling paint and a creaky porch. I remembered visiting as a child, but I'd never stayed long. Now it was mine. Part of me felt uneasy about living here, especially because everyone in the family whispered about the attic. Apparently, no one had ever gone up there, not even my mother. I stepped inside, dropped my backpack on the couch, and let the silence settle. The house smelled of dust and old wood. A few of my grandmother's belongings were still around. Knitted throws on the furniture, little trinkets on the shelves. The only thing truly locked was the attic door upstairs. It had a rusted padlock. I could see faint scratches on the door frame. My grandmother, Senora Wainwright, had never explained why she kept it sealed. That first day, I didn't head to the attic. I felt anxious. Instead, I cleaned up the living room and tried to figure out what to do with her possessions. Most were outdated clothes and random knickknacks. The more I looked through her things, the more I sensed her presence. She'd spent decades here alone after my grandfather died, but we rarely visited. As evening came, the place felt lonely. I slept on the couch that night, drifting in and out of an uneasy doze. Early the next morning, I decided to open the attic. I found the tools in my grandfather's old storage bin and forced the padlock. It snapped with a loud pop. The door itself stuck, but a firm push made it budge. A stale rush of air hit me. I stepped onto the attic stairs. It smelled like dust and something else I couldn't identify, maybe old newspapers or musty fabrics. Dim light came in through a small window near the far end. I climbed carefully, each step creaking. When I reached the top, I saw piles of boxes, a few chests, and an old rocking chair. It faced a dirty window, and it looked like it hadn't been moved in years. I spent most of that day sorting through the boxes. They contained my grandmother's journals, photos, letters, and old craft supplies. It felt like I was trespassing on her private world. I found entries in her notebooks about her loneliness and how she'd spend hours upstairs talking to someone or something. I didn't recognize the names she used or the references she made, but the notes gave me chills. They said things like, "He listens to me," or "He's always here at sundown." She never mentioned who he was. When I finally took a break, I set a stool near the rocking chair to rest. I looked around at the rafters, noticing cobwebs and gaps in the insulation. The chair looked sturdy yet old. I tried to shift it. It was heavier than I expected, like it was bolted to the floor. It squeaked a little. I shrugged and went back downstairs. That night, I lay in bed, trying to relax. I heard a faint noise above me, like something rubbing against the attic floor. I sat up, heart pounding. It sounded like a gentle creak, as if the chair was rocking. I told myself it was just the house settling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was up there. I flipped on the lamp, listened for a few minutes. The noise stopped. I told myself it was my imagination and managed to fall asleep. The following morning I felt determined to make the attic more livable. I planned to repaint it, maybe store my own boxes there. I went up with a bucket of paint and some brushes. When I tried to move the rocking chair away from the window, it felt as if the chair weighed more than it should. I strained my arms and legs, but it barely slid a few inches. My back started hurting. I gave up and left it where it was. I focused on clearing space around the chair and sweeping. The entire time, I felt like someone was standing behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but no one was there. My skin prickled, and my stomach felt tight. I tried turning on music, but the attic walls muffled the sound, and it didn't help my nerves. Later, I went downstairs to make lunch. I tried to forget the strange tension. While I ate, I heard a sudden thump from above. It made me jump. I rushed upstairs, half expecting to find something knocked over. The attic looked the same, except now the rocking chair had moved back to its exact original position by the window. I stood there, blinking. I thought maybe I'd remembered its position incorrectly. Still, my gut told me something was off. I checked my phone's camera roll to see if I had any pictures. I'd snapped one earlier that morning, and in it, the chair was angled differently. Now it was dead center. My heart pounded, and my neck felt hot. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the chair wasn't as heavy as I thought, and I'd accidentally bumped it. But I knew that didn't make sense. I looked for drag marks on the floor. The dust was disturbed in a neat path that led back to the original spot. My chest felt tight. I felt cold sweat forming on my forehead. I backed out of the attic. I decided I needed a break. I locked the door again and left the house for a few hours. I walked around the neighborhood, hoping fresh air would calm me. When I returned, it was late. I planned to head straight to bed, but a mix of fear and curiosity drove me to check the attic door. I placed my ear against it. I heard a faint squeaking noise, like something rocking. I stood there for at least a minute listening. My heart thumped in my chest. I almost opened the door, but I lost my nerve. I hurried downstairs, turned on the TV, and tried to block it out. For the next few days, I avoided going back up. I slept in my grandmother's old bedroom, but I kept hearing those light rhythmic creaks at night. Sometimes they stopped when I listened closely, and sometimes they continued for a few seconds. My body felt tense and jumpy each morning. My appetite shrank, and I started feeling short of breath whenever I thought about the attic. I reviewed more of her journals, searching for an explanation. She wrote about how the attic brought her comfort, how she spent her final years talking to someone in the chair. She described it as a companion. I couldn't understand how she found comfort in that. Eventually, I decided I couldn't live in fear. One afternoon, I grabbed a hammer and nails. I planned to seal the attic door from the outside. I went upstairs, told myself I needed to see this through. The rocking chair was still by the window. Everything looked still. I felt like the air had a slight vibration, but I couldn't see any movement. I forced myself to speak out loud. I'm just moving the chair, repainting, and then I'm locking this door. I felt foolish talking to an empty attic. I grabbed the chair's arm and pulled. It didn't budge. I dug my feet in, tried again, and it scraped across the floor. It took all my strength. A wave of cold air blew across my face, even though the window was shut. I swore under my breath, then I dragged the chair to the corner. The wood let out a groan, like something protesting. My hands shook. I backed away from the chair, breathing hard. The entire attic felt charged. I raced downstairs, leaving the chair in the corner. I went out to the garage, got a new padlock and some heavier nails. When I came back up, the door was open, even though I'd left it shut. I felt a shiver. I didn't see any footprints, but the air smelled different, like stale perfume. My heart hammered. I slammed the attic door shut, hammered in a couple of nails, and secured the new padlock. I tested it. It held. I did my best to ignore the sudden rush of fear that I'd just locked something in or out. That night, I slept fitfully. Around 3 a.m, I jolted awake to a creaking sound directly above me. It was steady, like the chair was rocking over and over. I buried my face in the pillow, trying to block out the noise. It went on for about 5 minutes, then silence. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I wanted to pack up and leave, but the house was mine now. I had nowhere else to go. In the days that followed, I heard less and less from upstairs. The tension in my chest still lingered, but I managed to function. I did normal chores, replaced old light bulbs, and cleaned. I noticed that every time a breeze rattled the windows, I felt a twinge of unease. I half expected to hear that creaking again. I tried to keep busy, organizing my grandmother's paperwork. Finally, I decided to store some of her old notebooks in a plastic bin. One of them fell open on a page that read, "I'm never alone in that attic. He keeps me company." I slammed the book shut. I realized she'd found some sort of presence up there, and she seemed to embrace it. I couldn't. I wanted no part of it. I keep the attic locked now. The chair stays in the corner. Sometimes, at night, I think I hear a soft creak or a muffled thump, but it's never as loud as before. It's like a faint reminder that something remains up there. I don't have a logical explanation. I don't care to investigate further. I just live downstairs, keep the door locked, and try not to think about it. I can't say I feel fully settled. I plan on eventually moving, but for now, I stay. Each time I pass the staircase, I sense a slight tension in the air, as if the attic still wants my attention. I ignore it. I focus on the ordinary parts of the house. I do my laundry, cook my meals, and watch TV. But every time I look at the padlock on that door, I remember how heavy that rocking chair felt, how it slid back to its original spot, and how my grandmother wrote about her quiet companion. I don't know what she found up there, but I don't need any more answers. I just live with the locked door and the memory of the slow, unsettling creaks in the dark. That's all I can handle. I hope it stays that way. I arrived in Santa Fe on a clear afternoon, my car covered in dust from the highway. I planned to spend a night camping in the hills to catch the full moon. I had heard about a particular clearing that offered a perfect view of the lunar rise, and I wanted to experience it for myself. I'd been on a few night hikes before, but never in this region. The moment I pulled into the small parking area by the trailhead, I felt a sense of calm. The horizon was wide and the skies were open. It felt right. I packed my small tent, a sleeping bag, and enough water to last through the evening. A friend had mentioned the trail was only a couple of miles to a flat clearing, used sometimes by local hikers. The sun was beginning its slow descent as I set out, following a narrow path of gravel and sand. Stunted pines dotted the landscape, and the ground had patches of dry grass. Each step kicked up a small cloud of dust, and the air smelled faintly of juniper. As I hiked, I noticed the temperature shifting. It was warm, but I could feel a drop in the air as the sun inched lower. My backpack jostled with each step, and I occasionally paused to sip water. The surroundings were quiet, aside from the crunch of my boots on the path and a distant rustle of wind in the brush. There were no other hikers in sight, which felt odd because I'd read that this area was popular for watching sunsets. Maybe the full moon crowd arrived later, I thought. I reached the clearing about an hour before sunset. It was a slight dip in the land, surrounded by scattered rocks and low shrubs. I chose a flat spot near a small cluster of stones to pitch my tent. The ground was firm but workable, so it only took a few minutes to set up. Then I laid out a small foldable chair and sat down to relax. The sun sank below the distant mountains, turning the sky a muted orange. The temperature dropped again, and I pulled on a light jacket. I felt a mix of excitement and nerves about staying there alone. But the quiet was peaceful, and the view of the mountains was spectacular. I made a quick meal of nuts and jerky, not wanting to waste time with a complicated setup. I drank some water, and then I waited. The moon was set to rise not long after nightfall. I got comfortable, checking my watch occasionally. Finally, the sky darkened to a deep blue, and the moon began to peak above the ridge. Its glow spread across the clearing, casting soft shadows on the rocks and shrubs. I stood up, entranced by how bright it was becoming. The moonlight lit the ground in a faint silver, almost like a dim spotlight. The air felt cooler, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. I decided to walk around a bit to take in the view from different angles. That was when I heard a faint ringing noise, like a distant bell. The sound was metallic and soft, carrying on the wind. I paused, looking around for the source, but I saw no one. I listened more carefully. The bell chimed again, rhythmic and steady. My pulse sped up. I wasn't scared yet, but I was alert. The sound didn't fit the surroundings. I took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, following the noise. A short distance away, I saw a smaller circle of stones. They formed a rough ring, each stone about knee height. At the center, something caught the moonlight, reflecting it in a bright gleam. I approached slowly, keeping an eye on the ground so I wouldn't trip. The ringing continued, but I still didn't see its source. Then I spotted a small silver bell resting on one of the stones. It looked old, with scratches along its surface. There were intricate patterns near the handle. The bell itself was not moving, yet the ringing persisted, as if the sound existed independent of the physical bell. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I glanced around, trying to see if there was someone else. There was no one in view. The circle of stones looked undisturbed. I reached out toward the bell, my hand shaking a bit. I hesitated but decided to pick it up. The metal felt cold, as though it had been in a freezer. The ringing stopped immediately, and the quiet around me became overwhelming. I felt an odd pressure in my ears, like the air around me had changed. Then a gust of wind swept through the clearing, making me shiver. The stones around me vibrated slightly, or so it seemed. I set the bell down on the stone again, my heart pounding. The moment I released it, the faint ringing resumed. It was the same gentle chime, as though I had never picked it up. My breath came quicker, and I tried to understand what was happening. I felt my hands tremble, and I took a step back. Suddenly, I noticed human silhouettes at the edge of the clearing, several yards away. I could make out 3 or 4 figures standing among the rocks. They wore long garments that moved in the breeze. The moonlight fell on them, giving me a partial view of their shapes. My mouth went dry. They didn't speak or call out. They only stood there, watching. I lifted a hand in a small wave, unsure what else to do. They showed no reaction. The bell's chiming grew louder, echoing in my mind. My chest tightened, and my scalp tingled with nervous energy. I took a step forward, thinking maybe they needed help or wanted to communicate. As I did, one figure raised its arms toward the moon, and the others followed. They stood that way for a moment, arms lifted. My ears started ringing, and I realized the bell's sound was merging with a faint hum in my head. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The figures lowered their arms, then turned their faces toward me. Even in the moonlight, I couldn't see their features clearly. They seemed to vanish like a sudden puff of air, as if they were never there. My heart pounded, and I felt a rush of panic. I scanned the clearing, pivoting in place to see if they had moved behind me, but I saw nothing. I clutched my jacket, teeth chattering slightly. I heard the bells chime again, now distant and softer. I edged away from the stone circle and hurried back to my campsite. My legs felt wobbly, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. When I reached my tent, I zipped myself inside and crouched, breathing hard. I strained to hear any footsteps or movement outside, but the night was still. The only sound was the rapid thumping of my heartbeat. My mind raced with questions. Who were those people? Were they even real? Why did the bell ring if it wasn't being touched? I felt a knot in my stomach, thinking maybe I was in over my head. I told myself that I just needed to calm down, maybe try to sleep, and check the circle again in daylight. But the thought of spending the night there made my skin crawl. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully clothed, just in case I needed to run. Every few minutes I heard that gentle bell sound, drifting in and out. Each time my body tensed, and I wondered if the figures would return. I tried to close my eyes, but I kept imagining their silhouettes. My breathing stayed shallow. After a while, exhaustion set in. My thoughts blurred, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke before sunrise, startled by a low wind that buffeted the tent. My body felt stiff, and my neck ached from sleeping in a tense position. The night's events replayed in my head. I stepped out of the tent, blinking at the early light. The clearing had a grayish hue, and the moon was gone from the sky. I made my way back to the stone circle, feeling a dull ache in my temples. My nerves were still on edge. When I reached the stones, the circle looked the same as before. The silver bell was gone. I examined the ground, expecting to see footprints or marks. The dirt and scattered pebbles revealed no obvious signs of last night's visitors. My stomach churned with confusion. I stood there for a moment, then paced around the area. Nothing. No bell, no indication of where it went. The place felt empty, even more so than the previous evening. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows. I returned to camp, packed my tent, and decided to head back to my car immediately. I kept looking over my shoulder during the walk, half expecting to see shapes moving behind me. The memory of those silhouettes raising their arms to the moon made my blood pound in my ears. I couldn't get it out of my head. When I finally reached the parking area, I exhaled in relief. My car was still there, and no one else was around. I drove into town, unsettled and tired. I told my story to only a few people. One older local recognized the details about the Ring of Stones. He said some of the indigenous tribes had legends about rituals using bells under a full moon, but nobody had a clear explanation for what I saw. Another person theorized it was a group of spiritual practitioners. I kept my own opinions to myself. I just knew what I experienced felt strange and unexplainable. Over the next few weeks, I had recurring dreams about the bell's chime. Sometimes I'd wake up convinced I could still hear that faint metallic tone. My heart would race, and I'd sit up in bed, scanning my dark bedroom. I never found a rational explanation for the events in that clearing. The figures disappeared, the bell vanished, and the only proof I had were my own memories. I still love the outdoors, but I avoid camping alone in remote spots now. Whenever the full moon comes around, I catch myself thinking back to that circle of stones. I recall how my hands trembled when I picked up the bell, and how the shadows seemed alive around me. I remember the rush of wind, the sudden appearance of those silent figures, and their abrupt disappearance. I keep quiet about it most of the time, not wanting people to treat me like I'm imagining things. But deep down, I know what happened was real enough to leave me with an uneasy feeling. If anyone asks, I describe Santa Fe as a beautiful place full of art, culture, and scenic trails. But I also warn them that the hills can be unpredictable at night. I mention that there are stories about moonlit rituals and strange sightings, though I don't go into details. Some experiences are too personal to share unless I truly trust the listener. The memory of that bell and those silent shapes lingers with me, and it has changed how I think about the night sky and the secrets that might lie under its glow. I doubt I'll ever camp alone in those hills again, but I still feel a pull toward that land. It's a reminder that sometimes we encounter things that logic can't fully explain, and they leave a mark that doesn't fade easily. I first set eyes on that mirror in a stately old home in Mobile. I arrived on a Monday morning expecting a routine job. I'm a restorer of antique furniture and decor, and I often get calls from private clients who want appraisals. That morning, I parked in front of a large historical house. The paint was well kept, the garden neat, and the porch steps swept clean. Everything suggested a normal assignment, nothing out of the ordinary. I rang the doorbell, and a middle-aged woman let me in. She introduced herself as Mrs. Jacobs. She seemed anxious, but also polite. She mentioned that the mirror in the living room was unique and asked me to examine it carefully. Inside, the house felt cool, despite the heat outside. The living room had high ceilings with old light fixtures. The walls were lined with oil paintings in gilded frames, most showing people from the early 1900s. There, propped against one wall, was the mirror. It stood about 6 feet tall, with an ornate wooden frame carved to resemble clusters of flowers. The carvings had chipped paint, flaking in certain spots. Even so, the overall shape was impressive. I noticed something odd right away. The mirror seemed to have a faint double reflection, as if 2 panes of glass were stacked together. When I moved to one side, I saw my reflection repeated. The front layer looked normal, while the second layer seemed dull or slightly delayed. My first thought was that the glass might be warped, or that there was some old mirror backing that needed replacing. Still, I felt a chill in my arms. I couldn't explain it immediately, but my gut told me this was no ordinary mirror. Mrs. Jacobs said that the mirror had been in her family for decades. She wanted an assessment of whether it could be restored. She had no interest in selling it. Her main concern was the shape of the frame. I nodded, got my notepad, and kneeled down to examine the bottom corners. Small cracks ran along the edge of the wood. I used a tiny flashlight to check for rot. As I worked, I felt a strange draft, as if cold air was seeping from behind the mirror. After a few minutes, I stood up and inspected the glass. I ran a soft cloth along the surface, wiping away the thin film of dust. The reflection of the room brightened, and I could see myself more clearly. Behind that front reflection, the second layer showed a faded version of me. It didn't follow my every movement exactly. The discrepancy was slight, but I spotted it. When I tilted my head, the reflection in the back layer seemed to pause an instant before doing the same. My stomach tightened. I tried to dismiss it as an optical illusion. Mrs. Jacobs watched me with concern. She asked if anything was wrong. I forced a reassuring smile and explained that the mirror was a bit unusual, possibly 2 layers of glass fused together, and that I wanted to do more tests at my workshop. She agreed. We arranged for me to return the next day with a truck to transport the mirror. I left feeling uneasy. That night, I slept poorly, picturing that delayed reflection. The following afternoon, I returned with my assistant. We carefully loaded the mirror into a padded crate and drove it to my workshop downtown. Once inside, I set the mirror upright under good lighting and took out my tools. I tested the wood for moisture, tapped the frame for hidden cracks, and made notes. The entire time, I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, like static electricity. My assistant kept glancing at the mirror, saying it gave him the creeps. I told him to focus on the frame while I examined the glass. I used a mild cleaning solution on the front layer. As I wiped, I felt an odd coldness radiating through my gloves, like the surface was several degrees cooler than the ambient temperature. Then, as I polished, I caught a glimpse of movement in the second layer, something that didn't line up with my own actions. It looked as though my reflection in that deeper pane had turned its head slightly toward me, while I was still facing forward. I froze, my chest tightening. I blinked hard, telling myself I was just tired. My assistant asked if I needed a break. I mumbled something about being fine and continued. We finished for the day, leaving the mirror in the corner of my workshop. But I couldn't stop thinking about that delayed reflection. That night, I tossed and turned. I dreamed of a face pressed against the glass from the inside. I woke up around 3 a.m., heart pounding. I felt a deep sense of dread and nearly called my assistant to pick the mirror up and return it to Mrs. Jacobs. But I told myself that was ridiculous. I was a professional. I would do my job. The next day, I tried a few methods to see if I could separate the front glass from the back. I wanted to determine if there was some older reflective layer behind a newer sheet. I gently pried at the edges of the frame, careful not to break anything. While I worked, I kept seeing subtle flickers in that second reflection. It felt like someone was shifting around in there, watching me. My heart rate climbed every time I caught those flickers. At one point, I leaned in and examined the space between the two sheets. It looked sealed, no clear gap. I couldn't detect any typical sign of a standard double mirror construction. Late in the afternoon, I placed the mirror under a strong lamp to photograph the frame details. The shop was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioner in the background. My assistant had stepped out for coffee. Suddenly, I heard a soft tapping sound, like knuckles against glass. It came from the mirror itself. I stood up straight, adrenaline surging. The tapping repeated, 3 or 4 gentle knocks. My throat went dry. I walked closer, though my legs felt shaky. I peered into the reflection. My front reflection looked normal, but the deeper layer showed my face angled up, as though I was looking directly into my own eyes, except I hadn't tilted my head back. My actual body was still leaning forward. A wave of cold fear spread through my chest. I stepped back, breathing heavily, and the reflection in the second layer shifted to match my movement, but slower, like a lagging video feed. Then the tapping stopped. I told myself I needed a break. I left the workshop, locked it up, and walked around the block, trying to clear my head. I felt unsteady, like I'd just escaped a dangerous situation. My assistant found me outside and said I looked pale. I didn't share the details. I just said I needed a moment. After regaining my composure, I decided we would deliver the mirror back to Mrs. Jacobs the next day. I had enough material to write up a partial report. I had no desire to keep it around any longer. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I felt as though I'd hear that tapping at any moment. In my imagination, the mirror was in my living room instead of my workshop, knocking in the dark. Around dawn, I drifted off, only to dream that I was trapped between the two panes, calling for help. When I woke up, I knew I had to finalize everything quickly. I was done with this job. Around mid-morning, my assistant and I loaded the mirror back into the truck. I gave him a terse explanation, saying the frame repair was minimal and I wouldn't be able to fix the glass. He didn't question me. He also seemed relieved to see it go. We drove to Mrs. Jacobs's house, and I tried to keep my eyes on the road instead of the rearview mirror. I had this horrible notion that if I looked, I might see something crawling in the back, inside that reflection. When we arrived, Mrs. Jacobs guided us to the same living room. We placed the mirror exactly where it had been. I explained that I couldn't fully restore the glass. She could either leave it as is or hire another specialist to try a more invasive procedure. She seemed disappointed but politely thanked me. I avoided going into the details of what I'd witnessed. I doubted she would believe me anyway. Before I left, she asked if I wanted to stay for a cup of tea. I politely declined, saying I had other appointments. But the truth was, I felt an urge to get away from that mirror as fast as possible. I walked out to the truck, exhaling the tension that had built up inside me. My assistant and I drove off. On the way home, we didn't say much. He played some music softly, and I stared out the window, thinking about the tapping sound and that second reflection. For days afterward, I had nightmares. I pictured someone or something stuck behind those layers, knocking and trying to get out. I caught myself glancing at reflective surfaces in my home, worried I might see a delayed reflection or another hidden shape. I'd never felt so uneasy around a piece of furniture before. Usually, I love the history and craftsmanship of antiques, but this was different. It felt wrong, as though it carried a presence I couldn't understand. I eventually wrote a short message to Mrs. Jacobs, suggesting she keep an eye on any changes in the mirror. I kept my wording professional, saying the glass might degrade further. I didn't mention ghosts or spirits. She never replied. I decided it was best not to follow up. If she had a strange experience with the mirror, maybe she'd contact me, but I had no desire to pursue it on my own. It's been some time now, and I've worked on other projects, but every so often, I recall that mirror's second reflection. I remember how my own image seemed to stare at me from behind the front glass, how the timing was off, and how I heard those deliberate knocks. Even thinking about it now makes my pulse race. I can't explain it logically, and I've stopped trying. I just know I never want to be in the same room with that mirror again. I still do restoration work in Mobile and the surrounding areas. Sometimes a client will ask if I can handle antique mirrors. I usually say yes, but feel a tightness in my chest. I do the job carefully, always checking the glass. And if I see even a hint of that double layer, I make an excuse or refer them to someone else. I'm not prepared to go through that kind of experience again. The memory is enough to remind me that some antiques might hold more than just old craftsmanship. They can carry something else, something that watches from behind the glass. I suspect Mrs. Jacobs still has the mirror in her living room. Maybe it just sits there, reflecting that same quiet space. Maybe everything has gone back to normal, and nothing unusual happens anymore. I try not to dwell on it. As far as I'm concerned, the job is finished, and I did what I could. But at night, when I pass by my own mirror in the hallway, I sometimes pause. I watch my reflection carefully to make sure it moves in time with me, exactly the way it should. Then I walk away, relieved to see that it's only a regular reflection and not something lurking on the other side, hoping to be seen. I arrived in Big Sur on a late afternoon, hoping to capture some photography of the coastline at sunrise. I had read about the dramatic cliffs and the rugged ocean views, and I wanted to challenge myself by camping near one of the more secluded areas. I found a small turnoff where I could park my car. The air smelled of salt, and the crashing waves below produced a constant roar. I felt both excited and uneasy about spending the night there. I set up my small tent on a patch of level ground, a few hundred yards from the cliff edge. The wind whipped at my jacket, and the temperature began dropping faster than I anticipated. I had a portable stove and some basic supplies, so I cooked a quick meal of canned soup. Then I checked my camera equipment to make sure it was ready for early morning shooting. The scenery already looked dramatic in the fading sunlight. Tall cliffs, swirling fog, and a wide expanse of ocean below. As dusk settled, I decided to walk closer to the cliff to see how steep the drop was. My boots crunched on the rocky ground, and I could feel the vibrations of the waves pounding the rocks far beneath me. I kept a safe distance from the edge, shining my flashlight to gauge the terrain. Suddenly the wind shifted, and I heard my name whispered faintly, as if carried by the breeze. I stopped, my heart thumping. I scanned the darkness but saw nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind whistling in a strange pattern. I retraced my steps to the tent. The night air felt colder, and the coastal wind stung my cheeks. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, determined to ignore the strange feeling that was creeping up on me. The repetitive sound of the ocean was oddly soothing, and I started drifting off. Then I heard it again, a voice, or maybe just the wind, but it sounded like it was calling my name. My eyes shot open, my pulse quickened, and I sat upright, listening carefully. The wind howled, and the ocean rumbled. I waited, but I heard nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. A few hours later, I woke to a bright moon overhead. The interior of my tent was dim, and the wind had died down to a gentler breeze. I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I put on my boots and unzipped the tent, shivering when the night air hit my face. The moonlight lit the cliffs, casting a pale glow across the craggy rocks. The sea looked silver and endless. I walked a short distance, staying aware of the cliff's location. That was when I heard my name again, clearer than before. It had a pleading tone, like someone asking for help. I froze, my stomach twisting. My flashlight shook in my hand. I scanned the area, aiming the beam across the scrub grass and rocky terrain. Nothing moved except the wisps of fog swirling near the ground. My heart pounded, and I considered the possibility of another camper messing with me. But I saw no other tents or vehicles. My campsite was the only one in this stretch. The voice repeated my name, urging me closer to the cliff. I felt a surge of fear and curiosity. Against my better judgment, I edged forward, staying far from the drop but angling the flashlight downward, hoping to see if anyone was stranded on a ledge. I shouted, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small against the roar of the ocean. I got no answer, only the rhythmic surge of waves below. Still, I felt sure I'd heard something. My palms were sweaty, and my mouth felt dry. The idea of going to the very edge made my head spin. Yet I inched a bit closer, shining the light down. The beam revealed only swirling mist and jagged rocks far below. The sea churned, sending white foam upward. I heard the voice again, this time more desperate, as though it came from the cliff itself. My skin crawled, and I staggered back, afraid I might lose my balance. I hurried back to my tent, fighting the urge to sprint. My mind was racing, trying to justify the sounds. Maybe the wind was carrying noise from another direction. Maybe someone on a distant part of the cliff was calling for help, but the echoes distorted it. Yet it sounded too much like my name. My hands shook as I zipped myself back into the tent. I stayed fully dressed in my jacket and boots in case I needed to run. Sleep was impossible. I kept expecting to hear that voice again. After about an hour, I started dozing off from sheer fatigue. I woke at dawn to the sound of seagulls overhead. My body felt stiff, and my head ached from lack of sleep. I crawled out of the tent, took a long drink of water, and forced myself to eat an energy bar. The morning light softened the eerie atmosphere. The cliff looked much more stable and less menacing in daylight. I grabbed my camera and tripod, heading closer to the cliff for the shots I wanted. The wind was calmer, and everything seemed ordinary again, except for the knots in my stomach. As I walked, I noticed footprints in the damp earth near the edge. They looked fresh, about the same size as mine. My pulse spiked at the sight of them because I didn't remember walking exactly at that spot in the night. I got closer and examined them. Each print pointed toward the cliff, not away from it. My hair stood on end. I circled around, checking if there were any other sets of footprints. I found none. It was just one set, leading straight to the drop-off. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe they were my own prints in some slightly different path, but the angle was wrong. I set up my camera, trying to push the weirdness aside. The morning light was incredible, and the waves were crashing dramatically against the rocks. I snapped several photos, adjusting the shutter speed to capture the spray. Despite the beauty, I felt a constant undercurrent of tension. I kept glancing at those footprints. I also caught myself listening for the voice, half expecting it to whisper in my ear at any moment. After finishing my shoot, I headed back to camp and started packing. I told myself it would be safer to find a more populated area, or even a campground with other people around. My nerves were still raw from the night's events. As I packed up the tent, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I straightened and turned. Along the cliff's edge, I saw a figure crouched low. It looked like a person, but the color of the clothing blended into the rocky background. My heart jolted. I shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. I took a few steps forward, holding my camera. I considered taking a photo, but my hands felt unsteady. Before I could move any closer, the figure slipped out of sight, disappearing behind a jutting rock. Panic flared in my chest. I rushed to the spot, worried someone might be injured or suicidal. The wind gusted as I approached the edge. Pebbles rolled under my feet, making me cautious with each step. I peered around the rock, expecting to see a person clinging to a ledge. There was no one there. The cliff dropped straight down, with no ledge to stand on. My pulse hammered as I realized there was nowhere for anyone to go. If someone had been there, they would have fallen. I stared down at the raging surf, feeling dizzy and sick. I stepped back quickly, forcing myself not to look any longer. My heart drummed so hard I thought I might faint. I ran back to my campsite, stuffed the last of my gear into the trunk of my car, and started the engine. I glanced at the cliff one more time, half expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing there. The morning sun bathed the entire area in a calm light that belied the unease churning inside me. I drove away, the winding coastal road forcing me to concentrate on the tight curves. Each time I checked the rearview mirror, I expected to see someone or something behind me. Once I reached a more populated stretch of road, I pulled into a gas station. My hands were still shaking. I bought a bottle of water, forcing myself to drink slowly. My reflection in the store window looked pale and exhausted. I had red lines under my eyes from lack of sleep, and my hair stuck out in odd directions. I considered telling the clerk about what happened, but I doubted they'd believe me. I also worried they might say someone did fall, and I'd be compelled to return or call the authorities. But there was no evidence except footprints and that fleeting glimpse of a figure. For the rest of my drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of the voice whispering my name haunted me, and the footprints leading to the cliff played over and over in my mind. Each time I thought about them, I felt a jolt of cold in my chest. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was mentally and physically drained. I still have the photographs from that morning. They show a gorgeous sunrise, a dramatic coastline, and the crashing ocean waves. Friends who see them always tell me how lucky I was to witness such beauty. I never share the other part of the story. I keep that night's events to myself, mostly because I can't explain them. Sometimes I lie awake replaying the sound of my name carried on the wind. Other times, I imagine that figure crouching by the cliff, silently watching the water below. I wonder what would have happened if I had ventured closer. I haven't gone back to Big Sur alone since then. If I need to photograph that area, I bring a friend or choose a crowded lookout. I don't want to experience the isolation and the sense of something calling me from the cliffs. I still think about that voice. I wonder if there have been accidents on that stretch of coastline, travelers swept off by the wind or lured too close by curiosity. The locals sometimes mention ghost stories or lost souls who wander the cliffs. Whether or not they're true, my own memories are enough to convince me to be careful. In the end, my night on the cliff gave me the photos I wanted and a lasting sense of unease. I remind myself that nature can be dangerous, both physically and in ways I can't fully describe. When I think about returning to Big Sur, I remember the footprints, the whisper, and the figure that vanished into thin air. I've decided that some sights, no matter how beautiful, aren't worth the risk of facing those unanswered questions ever again. I first heard rumors about a hidden underground hotel near Salt Lake City through an online forum dedicated to urban legends. Most people on the forum dismissed the story as a hoax, but a few claimed they had found a maintenance tunnel that led to a series of abandoned corridors. One commenter mentioned old hotel signs in those corridors and insisted they had seen rooms labeled with numbers. My curiosity got the best of me. I do a lot of urban exploring, and I've become familiar with sneaking into boarded-up buildings and closed-off spaces. This rumored underground hotel seemed like the perfect place to investigate. I spent a week gathering information, searching old city plans, and chatting with a couple of local explorers who had tried to find the place. None of them had any definitive proof, but they pointed me toward a service tunnel near the downtown area. It was supposedly sealed off behind a locked iron door. They said it led to a network of tunnels that might connect to the rumored hotel. One person even mentioned hearing faint music echoing down the corridors, though they left before venturing too far. I told myself it was probably just leftover ventilation noise, but I still felt a twinge of excitement. Early on a Saturday morning, I parked in a nearly empty lot a few blocks from the spot. I wore dark clothes and carried a small backpack with a flashlight, extra batteries, a camera, and some basic tools. The street above was quiet. Most stores weren't open yet, and I passed only a couple of people on my way. I followed a narrow alley until I reached a section of the sidewalk with a locked metal hatch. That hatch was sealed, just as I had expected. I peeked around the corner, noticing a fenced-off area leading beneath a building. The fence had a chain and padlock, but the chain was loose. I maneuvered it aside and slipped in. I found myself in a cramped space filled with old pipes and the smell of damp concrete. The lighting was poor, so I turned on my flashlight. After a few steps, I saw a steel door at the far end. It looked heavy, and it was partially rusted along the bottom. I tried the handle. It didn't budge. Then I noticed the lock was broken, like someone had smashed it with a hammer. That surprised me, but it also made me think I was in the right place. Maybe other explorers had forced it open. I took a deep breath and gave the door a push. It screeched open, revealing a dim corridor. Immediately, I noticed a musty odor. The concrete walls soon gave way to something else, old wallpaper peeling along the edges. I played my flashlight over it, and it looked like a faded floral pattern you might see in a historic hotel. A worn carpet stretched down the hallway, stained with water damage and dark patches of mold. My heart pounded as I advanced, noticing how the space felt more like a hotel's hallway than a utility tunnel. I passed a few doors along the corridor. Some had room numbers, missing only a single digit. For example, I saw 10 town, where the missing digit might have been an 8 or a 9, I couldn't tell. The doorknobs were rusty, and a couple of the doors were slightly ajar. I aimed my flashlight inside one room and saw a small table and chair covered in dust, like the remnants of a guest room. There was a stale odor, and the air felt unnaturally cold. The ceiling light fixture dangled, broken. At that point, I realized I might truly be in some kind of secret hotel wing or underground structure. I continued further and found a T intersection. The left corridor was blocked by collapsed debris, so I went right. Eventually, I stumbled upon a large sign mounted on the wall that read, "Reception," with an arrow pointing forward. My pulse quickened. I followed the arrow. The carpet squished under my feet, and I spotted cracks in the wall. It was clear that water had seeped in from above at some point. The place felt unstable. Part of me knew it was risky to keep going, but I was too curious. After a short walk, the corridor opened into a wide lobby area. A dim overhead lamp flickered, giving off a weak yellow glow. The sight startled me because it suggested there was still some power flowing through this place, at least in spots. The reception counter stood in the middle, with a dusty bell on top. Beside it hung rows of old-fashioned room keys, most still labeled with tarnished metal tags. I stepped closer and saw a guest ledger lying open on the counter. My hand shook as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting looked old, with names and dates going back decades. Then I noticed strange notes next to some of the entries. One read, "Never checked out." Another read, "Lost in room 112." It gave me chills. I felt like I was intruding on something that had been left buried for a reason. Suddenly, a series of lights flickered along the corridor behind me, as though someone had flipped a switch. The overhead bulbs buzzed weakly, lighting up a row of doors that stretched into the darkness. My heart pounded. There was no sign of anyone, but the electricity seemed to be turning itself on. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed, and I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. No answer. Then I heard the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and measured, though I couldn't see anyone. My palms got sweaty, and I backed away from the corridor. I decided to check one of the nearby rooms, hoping to find some explanation. The first door I opened was slightly stuck, but I forced it open with a shoulder push. Inside was a small bedroom with a musty mattress and a broken lamp. A single suitcase lay open on the floor, its contents spilling out. Old clothes, discolored by time. My flashlight revealed a thick layer of dust, but the clothes looked as if they'd been hastily tossed aside. It gave me a sinking feeling. I snapped a quick photo, then left the room. I returned to the lobby area, thinking I might retrace my steps and leave. The atmosphere felt oppressive, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Right then, the old reception bell on the counter gave a soft ding, like someone had tapped it. I jerked around, shining my flashlight, but no one was there. I swallowed hard. The footsteps sounded again, this time from somewhere near the reception desk. I strained my eyes, seeing only shifting shadows cast by the flickering light. Suddenly, a shape rose from behind the counter. At first, it looked like a person leaning forward, but its outline was strange. Its head area was blurry, like a void. I froze. My breathing grew rapid, and my throat felt constricted. The shape seemed to notice me. It lifted what looked like an arm, as if it was about to set something on the counter. I couldn't move. Then the lights flickered. In that split second of darkness, I heard a raspy sound, almost like a whisper or a heavy breath. When the lights came back on, the shape was gone. I felt a spike of terror in my stomach. I spun around, half expecting it to be behind me. I saw nothing. I realized I needed to leave immediately. I started running back down the corridor, ignoring the lumps in the carpet that threatened to trip me. The overhead lights flickered off again, plunging me into darkness, so I relied on my flashlight beam bobbing with each step. I kept expecting to feel a hand on my shoulder or see that shape blocking my path. By the time I reached the original hallway where I had entered, I was gasping for air. My flashlight caught glimpses of more doors, some wide open, revealing scenes of disarray. A half-eaten meal rotting on a bedside table, a single shoe in the middle of a hallway, a broken mirror leaning against a wall. It was like people had left in a hurry, or never left at all. The sense of dread made my chest tighten further. Finally, I spotted the iron door through which I had come. It stood ajar, just as I left it. My footsteps echoed on the concrete as I darted through the doorway and into the small, cramped area with pipes overhead. The musty smell gave way to a rush of cooler, fresher air. I yanked the door shut behind me. It wouldn't lock, so I wrapped the broken chain around the handles as best I could. My hands shook uncontrollably. I navigated the fenced-off area and emerged into the alley. The sudden glare of morning sunlight felt shocking, like I had stepped from one world into another. My lungs felt starved for normal air. I hurried back to my car without looking back. Once I was inside and the doors were locked, I sat there, shaking, my heart still pounding in my throat. It took a few minutes before I felt capable of driving. Later that day, I tried to rationalize what I saw. I considered the possibility of illusions caused by dim lights and my own anxiety. But I couldn't dismiss the memory of that ledger with ominous notes, the powered lights flickering on, or that shape behind the reception desk. I planned to return with better equipment, maybe with friends who could confirm what was there. But when I went back the next weekend, I couldn't find that fenced entrance. I walked the entire alley, checked the walls, examined every door. The area looked different, as if the structure had been replaced or sealed. It made no sense. I haven't been able to locate that door again. Part of me is relieved. Another part of me feels compelled to keep searching, to prove I didn't imagine it. But each time I think about that shape, I feel a deep unease that stops me. I'm not sure what would have happened if I stayed in that underground hotel. I don't know if anyone else has ventured in since. I only know that whatever is down there, it doesn't seem to want people finding it. The ledger's words echo in my mind sometimes. Never checked out. Disappeared in room 109. I can't shake the feeling that some secrets are better left alone, and that beneath Salt Lake City's busy streets lies a place where guests enter but never leave. I arrived in Key West with high expectations for a peaceful vacation. I wanted something different this time, something more adventurous than a typical hotel or condo. That's why I rented a floating house near the marina. The online listing made it look cozy and unique. The photos showed wooden floors, a simple kitchen, and a small deck looking out onto the calm waters. The owner, a man named Peter, said that most people avoided that particular houseboat, but he offered a good discount. I didn't think much of it. I was more interested in the novelty of sleeping on the water. On my first day, I drove into Key West, picked up a few groceries, and parked in the marina lot. The late afternoon sun made the water sparkle. The floating house stood on the far side of the dock, a small structure tethered to a mooring. A narrow wooden walkway led to its main door. I rolled my suitcase down the dock, hearing the boards creak underfoot. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. Seagulls circled overhead, and a few fishing boats were coming in with the day's catch. It felt like a classic coastal scene. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I noticed a compact living area with a couch, a small table, and a kitchenette. Everything appeared simple but functional. A short hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The place had an old, musty odor, though. I opened a few windows to let the breeze in. The house rocked gently with the movement of the water. It felt soothing, almost like being lulled by gentle waves. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. I was tired from the drive and the humidity. In the morning, I discovered something odd outside the door. There were wet footprints on the small deck. They were about the size of an adult's feet, but they had a peculiar shape, as if the toes were splayed. I initially shrugged it off, thinking maybe a curious local had come by, or that it was just some accident with a passing boater's drip trail. Still, it made me uneasy. I wiped them away and tried to forget about it. During the day, I explored the island, visiting shops and trying local seafood. The atmosphere was lively, filled with tourists and street performers. I got back to the houseboat just before sunset. The soft orange light reflected off the water, and I could see small fish darting beneath the surface. I sat on the deck with a cold drink, watching the horizon turn pink and purple. The calm water felt comforting. I told myself this would be a relaxing stay. Later that night, I heard a rhythmic banging against the underside of the floating house. It sounded like someone knocking on the hull from below. Thump, 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 always in sets of 3. I got up from the couch, heart racing, and peered out the windows. I couldn't see anything in the dark water. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped onto the deck. The knocking continued. I leaned over the railing, shining my light on the water's surface. Nothing. The noise abruptly stopped. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was holding my breath. After a few moments of silence, I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself it could be debris bumping into the houseboat or some fish, but my nerves stayed on edge. The silence felt heavy, and I found myself frequently glancing at the windows, half expecting a face to appear. Eventually, I went to bed, though I lay awake for a while, listening for sounds. The gentle rocking of the house returned, but every little creak or shift made me jump. When I finally dozed off, I had restless dreams about something knocking on the walls, trying to get in. By dawn, I was exhausted. I decided to shake off the anxiety by heading outside for some fresh air. That was when I noticed footprints again, this time inside the house on the living room floor. They were wet, as though someone had come directly from the water into the house. They led from near the door to the opposite side, disappearing where the floor dried. I felt a chill. I had locked the door from the inside, so how could anyone get in? My stomach flipped, and I rushed to check the door latch. It was still locked. The windows were all closed, too. I found no signs of forced entry. I started cleaning up the footprints. My hands shook as I toweled the floor. My mind raced with possibilities. An intruder, a prankster, or a break-in. I tried to rationalize that maybe I had left the door unlocked in my haste, but I knew I hadn't. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my temples. I felt a deep urge to pack my bags and leave, but I also didn't want to run off after just 2 nights, especially since I'd prepaid. I decided to talk to someone about it. At a nearby pier, I spoke with an older fisherman I'd seen around. His name was Earl. I asked him about the floating house without giving too many details. He shrugged and said some folks claimed the area was visited by strange swimmers at night, people or creatures that lurked in the waters. He didn't elaborate much, and I got the impression he didn't want to seem superstitious. I pressed him for more, and he just said something vague about lost souls who'd drowned off the coast. Then he went back to mending his nets, avoiding further conversation. That evening, I stayed out a little later, grabbing dinner in town to delay returning to the houseboat. When I finally got back, the place was dark and quiet. The water around it looked pitch black. I fumbled with the lock and stepped inside, turning on the interior lights. The houseboat felt cramped, and the musty smell seemed worse. The silence settled in quickly. I decided to watch some TV on my laptop to distract myself, but before long, I heard the rhythmic banging on the hull again. Thump, 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 pause, thump, thump, thump. My body tensed. I got up and moved slowly toward the back door. This time, I wanted to catch whatever was causing it. I turned off the interior lights so I could see outside better. My hands were shaking as I opened the door slightly and aimed my flashlight along the edges of the floating house. The water rippled beneath me. I scanned the area, seeing only dark waves. I was about to step onto the deck when I caught sight of something. A shape clung to the side of the house, near the waterline. It looked like a hand, pale and thin, gripping the edge of the deck. I gasped and dropped the flashlight beam lower. In an instant, the shape slipped back into the water with barely a splash. My heart pounded in my ears. I scrambled back inside and locked the door, pressing my shoulder against it as if expecting someone to barge in. I felt icy panic in my chest. My mind reeled with what I had just seen. A person? An animal? It was too large to be a fish or a regular sea creature. It looked vaguely human, but the skin was too pale, and the fingers seemed elongated. I trembled all over. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of the living room, trying to stay awake. Each small noise outside made me jump. Around dawn, I finally dozed off. When I woke, I found more wet footprints on the deck. This time, they led away from the door, as if something had been inside and left. My blood went cold. I could no longer pretend this was a normal occurrence. I had to get out. I grabbed my phone and called the owner, Peter, leaving a message that I was ending my stay early due to personal reasons. I packed my belongings, throwing them hastily into my suitcase. Before I left, I heard a faint scratch on the window. I glanced over and froze. A silhouette moved past the glass, slipping out of sight. I didn't investigate. I just hauled my suitcase onto the dock, locked the house behind me, and practically ran to my car. My heart thumped so hard that my chest hurt. Once inside my car, I locked the doors and stared at the houseboat, expecting to see something crawling onto the deck. Nothing appeared, but the sense of being watched didn't subside until I drove off the marina property. I found a last-minute motel room for the remainder of my trip. It was a simple place, but I felt safer with solid ground under my feet. I slept with the lights on and kept waking up from nightmares of pale arms grabbing the edge of my bed. On my last day, I considered returning to the marina to see if Peter had shown up. A part of me wanted closure, or at least an explanation. In the end, I decided against it. My hands still trembled at the thought of going near that houseboat again. Now, whenever people ask about my time in Key West, I stick to safe stories, the friendly bars, the sandy beaches, the famous sunset celebrations. I don't mention the floating house or the footprints on the deck. If they push me, I just say I left early because the place wasn't comfortable. I'm afraid they'd laugh or think I made it all up. But I know what I saw, and I know how terrified I felt. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I recall the rhythmic banging under the hull and the vision of that pale hand clinging to the side. I replay the scene in my mind, questioning whether I imagined it or if stress made me hallucinate. Yet the memory of the footprints and the wet floor is too vivid. I'm convinced that something roams those waters near Key West. I don't know if it's a creature or a person with strange intentions, but I don't plan on finding out. I haven't been back to Key West since. The whole experience left me with an unsettling reminder of how vulnerable I can feel when sleeping out on the water. Even now, I sometimes wake at night, convinced I hear a soft thumping against the side of a wall or window. I tell myself it's just a passing car or the pipes in my building. But a part of me can't help recalling that strange houseboat and the feeling that something was reaching out from the sea. I don't expect to understand it fully, but I do know I'll think twice before ever staying in another floating house. And if someone asks for a recommendation in Key West, I'll steer them toward a nice solid place on land. I remember my first day stepping into the majestic stage theater in Fort Wayne. It was a damp Tuesday afternoon, and the sky outside threatened rain. The exterior of the theater looked worn, with chipped paint and a faded marquee. The front doors creaked as I pulled them open. The place had a faint smell of old upholstery and dust. My acting group had invited me to rehearse there because they offered free space, and I was excited about the chance to perform on an actual stage, no matter how run down it looked. When I walked in, I felt a heavy quiet. The lobby had dim lighting, and the ticket booth was covered by a dusty cloth. I could see a few posters on the walls, advertising shows from decades ago. My footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. I noticed peeling wallpaper and a musty odor. It felt like the building hadn't been properly aired out in years. My chest tightened a little. I reminded myself that old theaters often have a stale atmosphere, and I kept going. I pushed open the doors leading to the main auditorium. Rows of seats stretched out in front of me, many of them torn or covered with sheets to protect them from further damage. I saw a few other cast members milling near the stage, but the place still felt empty. The overhead lights were turned on just enough to see the front part of the stage. I stepped carefully down the aisle, my shoes crunching on scattered debris. I passed seat after seat, each one coated in a film of dust. The silence felt unnatural for a theater. Our director, Mark, greeted me near the foot of the stage. He pointed to a side door leading to the dressing rooms. He said we could store our bags there. I walked backstage, pushing aside a heavy curtain. The backstage area was cramped and cluttered with old props, broken chairs, and a large wooden trunk with a busted latch. I found a corner and set down my bag, listening to the faint sound of the others talking out front. The air back there felt colder. My arms got goosebumps, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Once I returned to the auditorium, Mark briefed us on the rehearsal plan. We were a small group, practicing a short drama scene. I noticed that some stage lights still worked, casting bright spots where we'd perform. The rest of the theater lay in shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I brushed it off as nerves. After all, it was my first time rehearsing in a place this large. We started running lines. The acoustics were decent, though the place felt hollow. Our voices echoed strangely, almost as if the sound came back a fraction of a second too late. During my first line, I thought I heard a whisper in the far left section of the balcony. I stumbled over my words, glancing up at the dark seats. My heartbeat picked up. Mark asked if I was okay, and I mumbled that I just needed another try. I focused on my script and tried to ignore the balcony. As we continued, I occasionally caught faint noises, like low whispers or soft footsteps. Each time I stopped and looked around. No one was moving, and the auditorium remained mostly dark. My scene partner, Clarice, noticed my distraction. She asked if something was wrong, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I said I thought I heard a draft. She shrugged and told me not to let it rattle me. An hour into rehearsal, the power flickered. The stage lights blinked, leaving us in near darkness. My stomach clenched. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, waiting for the lights to come back. When they did, Mark just brushed it off, saying the wiring in the old place was probably unstable. We pressed on. I concentrated on my lines, determined not to let the weird atmosphere ruin my focus. But then I heard a single clap echoing from somewhere above. It sounded like an isolated applause, the kind you might hear if someone was watching and appreciating a specific moment. Everyone else paused, looking around with confusion. Mark called out, "Hello? Someone up there?" No answer. I heard my own breathing grow faster. Nobody else claimed to have seen anyone. We all exchanged uneasy glances. We tried to continue. As we moved into a dramatic portion of the script, I delivered a line with extra emotion. Right after I finished, there it was again. A solitary clap. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. My hands got clammy, and my knees felt weak. Mark told us to keep going, but I could see he was unsettled too. The others seemed spooked. I saw Clarice fiddling with her script, clearly nervous. After another few lines, we all heard soft murmurs coming from behind the stage curtains. It sounded like someone speaking rapidly, but the words were muffled. Mark walked to the side of the stage, flung the curtain open, and aimed his flashlight around. Nothing was there except the dusty backstage area. Still, the murmurs continued for a few seconds longer, then abruptly stopped. I felt my heart pounding. My mouth went dry. We decided to take a break. I went backstage to get a bottle of water from my bag. The corridor backstage felt even colder. My throat tightened, and I felt a strange tension in the air. As I turned a corner, I saw a shadow pass across the wall in front of me, as if someone had walked by. When I got to that spot, there was no one there. My heart lurched. I tried to remain calm, but I broke into a light sweat. I grabbed my water and returned to the stage, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. Some of the other cast members admitted they heard weird noises too. One said she felt like someone was touching her shoulder when no one was there. Another said he saw a figure standing in the wings, but it vanished when he looked directly at it. Mark tried to reassure us that old theaters are often creepy and that maybe homeless people sneaked inside. Still, none of us felt at ease. We pushed forward with rehearsal, hoping to finish before dark. At one point, I delivered a line flawlessly, exactly how I'd practiced it. The moment I finished, I heard a faint but distinct applause from somewhere in the balcony. This time, it sounded like 2 or 3 claps in quick succession. My chest clenched, and I struggled to stay in character. Mark dropped his clipboard, and it clattered to the floor. Nobody wanted to look at the balcony. The mood changed from tense to downright fearful. Shortly after, Clarice forgot her line and mumbled something incorrect. A low moan came from the side boxes, as if someone was groaning in disappointment. She jumped, then apologized to Mark, thinking he was the one who made the sound. He shook his head, pale-faced, insisting it wasn't him. I saw her eyes widen. The rest of us stood in silence. It felt like the theater itself was responding to our performance, judging us. Eventually, Mark decided we'd had enough. He said we should end rehearsal early and leave. I couldn't have agreed more. My nerves were shot, and I just wanted to get out. As we packed up, I went to retrieve my bag from backstage. The corridor light flickered, and I felt a chill. I noticed fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, as if someone had walked there recently. The footprints led to a side room we hadn't used. I stared at them, and a surge of panic rose in my chest. I grabbed my bag and hurried back to the auditorium, not wanting to find out who or what made those tracks. Back in the main area, I saw a dark figure in the upper balcony, just for a second. It looked like a person leaning forward. My breath caught in my throat, and my grip on the bag tightened. The figure vanished the moment I tried to focus on it. I didn't mention it to anyone. I just hurried to the exit with the others. We pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the early evening light. The city street outside felt comforting and normal. I took in a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. In the following days, we talked about the incidents among ourselves. One cast member refused to return. Another claimed that ghosts of old performers or directors haunted the majestic stage. I recalled hearing rumors that a director had died during a production decades ago. Some said his spirit never left, always seeking the perfect performance. I couldn't confirm any of it, but it matched the unsettling things we heard. The scattered applause, the disapproving noises when we made mistakes. I tried attending one more rehearsal there. That time, the environment felt even heavier. The same faint sounds of footsteps, the same sense of being watched. I lasted only half the session before my nerves got the best of me. My chest felt tight, and I found myself stumbling over lines because I kept waiting for another bizarre reaction from the invisible audience. Eventually, I told Mark I couldn't do it anymore and left. I felt a burst of relief once I stepped outside again. After that, I dropped out of the production. I couldn't focus on my performance with the tension looming over every rehearsal. I heard from a friend that the group eventually moved to another venue. They claimed scheduling conflicts, but I suspect everyone was just as disturbed as I was. A few insisted the majestic stage was haunted, while others tried to dismiss it as electrical issues or random echoes. To this day, I think about that solitary applause and the murmurs behind the curtains. I sometimes recall the faint figure in the balcony and the feeling of cold air in the backstage corridors. I haven't returned to the majestic stage. When people ask about the location, I simply say it's an old theater that needs lots of renovation. I choose not to share the details. Part of me still wonders if that spirit or presence is trapped there, critiquing every rehearsal from the shadows, clapping for good lines and groaning at mistakes. All I know is that it felt real enough to drive me away. Now I search for venues with bright lights, decent crowds, and a lively atmosphere. I avoid places that stand empty and echo with the faint sounds of unseen observers. The memory of those isolated claps in the majestic stage auditorium still makes my heart jump, and I doubt I'll ever fully forget the uneasy feeling of being judged by someone I couldn't see. My experience there changed how I view old theaters. I appreciate their history, but I'm also aware that some of them may harbor more than just stories from the past. The majestic stage taught me that sometimes the show goes on, even if the audience can't be seen. I picked that fisherman's cabin because I wanted solitude. My name is Melissa, and I write non-fiction books. After struggling to finish a manuscript, I searched for a quiet rental and found one near Myrtle Beach. The ad mentioned it was old but had a good view of the ocean. It sounded perfect for my needs, and the price was low. I didn't ask many questions. I just packed my car, drove out, and met the property manager briefly. He gave me the key, a short warning about the place's strange history. then left in a hurry. On my first day, I noticed the cabin looked worn. The wood was gray from salt air, and the windows were a bit foggy. It smelled damp inside, like old seaweed. The living area had a simple couch, a small table, and a couple of lamps. A separate room served as a bedroom, and there was a tiny kitchen that barely fit a stove and a fridge. I liked the isolation. At night, I heard the ocean waves crashing, and the breeze came through the window with the scent of brine. I told myself I'd get a lot of writing done, but the first sign of trouble was the uneasy feeling I got during that initial evening. I heard a low hum outside, like wind whistling, but it carried a softer, almost whispering quality. I couldn't make out words, but I had the impression of faint voices. I got up from my desk, where I'd been making notes, and peered out the window. Nothing stood out. The beach was dark, and the moonlight glinted off the waves. I sat back down, trying to ignore it, but my stomach felt tense. The next morning, I took a walk along the shoreline. The sand was scattered with old fishing nets, torn and tangled with seaweed. They smelled rotten, like fish left out in the sun. It seemed weird that anyone would leave them there. About 50 yards away, I noticed a circular pattern of fish bones. It was as though someone had arranged them in a shape, but it could have been the tide. I decided I didn't want to dwell on it. I took a quick picture with my phone, thinking maybe it could spark an idea for my manuscript. Later that day, I sat by the cabin's small desk, trying to type. A sudden creaking sound startled me. It came from the floorboards on the porch. I paused, listening for more movement. My pulse sped up. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I got up, walked outside. The porch was empty, but the boards were damp, as if water had dripped onto them recently. I checked for leaks in the roof. Nothing. It bothered me, but I told myself it was just condensation, or a brief gust of moist air. That evening, the smell of decaying fish grew stronger. I had all the windows closed, yet the stench lingered, clinging to the walls. It made me wrinkle my nose, and my stomach twisted. I lit a small scented candle to mask it, but the fish smell overpowered everything. I forced myself to ignore it and returned to my writing. Suddenly, I heard a scraping noise across the cabin floor, like something dragging along the wood. I spun around with my heart pounding. The door was locked and the windows were shut, yet the scraping continued for a few seconds. When I finally got up the nerve to move closer, the sound stopped. No object was out of place. My breathing felt shaky. On the third day, I noticed footprints in the sand near the cabin. They looked webbed, like large amphibian tracks, but they had a shape that suggested a heel and toes, although elongated. I bent down to examine them. The prints led to the water, then vanished where the waves lapped the shore. My heart pounded again, and I glanced around, feeling exposed. Nobody else was on the beach. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. At dusk, I heard more noises outside, like a wet, slithering sound, accompanied by a soft grunt or rasping breath. My hands started shaking. I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window, shining the beam onto the sand. I caught a glimpse of something moving near the water, but it darted behind a rock outcropping before I could make out details. It was tall, hunched, with a limb or tail trailing behind it. My chest constricted, and I felt trapped. I set the flashlight down. Every muscle in my body was tense. I couldn't sleep that night. Every few minutes, I thought I heard shuffling around the exterior of the cabin. Occasionally the windows rattled, though the wind was mild. Around midnight, I forced myself to look outside again, but I didn't see anything. I wondered if I should call the property manager or the police. But what would I say? That some strange creature was prowling the beach? I felt uncertain and foolish. Early the next morning, I walked along the porch, noticing wet trails leading from the sand up to my door. They looked like wide smears, as if something dragged seaweed or a wet cloth across the wood. A chill ran through me. I followed the marks to the side of the cabin, where they stopped abruptly near the crawl space. I crouched down and tried to shine my phone's light under the house. It smelled rotten, and the space was dark. I saw lumps of tangled netting, maybe more fish bones. My heart pounded so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I backed away, swallowing against the surge of nausea. I spent most of that day inside, feeling uneasy. The idea of walking on the beach made me anxious. I checked local stories online and found vague mentions of an old fisherman who had lived in that cabin. Some said he made a pact with sea spirits for big catches. Others said he vanished under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind rotting nets and weird carvings on the beach. No official records confirmed any of it, but I felt my stomach tighten as I read. I began to suspect I was dealing with something connected to that legend. That evening, the board started creaking again. Then a tapping sound came from outside the window, as if someone or something was testing the glass. I stood still, my hands clenched at my sides. My heart thumped in my chest. I felt a wave of cold sweat on my forehead. Slowly, I lifted the corner of the curtain. For half a second, I saw a faint silhouette with a vaguely human shape, but with a slick, scaly texture. Its eyes were dark, and its head seemed elongated. When it noticed my movement, it jerked away and disappeared into the darkness. My breath came in short gasps. My mind raced. I didn't know if I should grab my car keys or barricade myself inside. I kept pacing, clutching my phone, unsure if I should call anyone. I felt foolish and terrified. After a few minutes, I decided to pack my bags at sunrise and leave. I didn't care about losing the rental money. But the night wasn't over. Around midnight, I heard the sound of wet slapping on the porch. I realized that something was sliding something else across the wood. It felt deliberate, like it was being dragged. My pulse spiked. I approached the door cautiously, my hands trembling. The odor of rotting fish was so strong it made my eyes water. I held my breath and opened the door a crack. My porch was covered in seaweed and old netting, arranged in a partial circle, almost like a trap. Fear seized me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. In a corner of the cabin, I noticed an old black and white photograph I hadn't seen before. It showed a man in fishing gear, smiling at the camera. The back was dated many years ago. I guessed this was the fisherman who once lived here. It fit the rumors. A wave of revulsion hit me. I turned the photo face down on the table, not wanting to look at it anymore. I tried to sleep on the couch with the lights on, but every small noise made me jump. I kept thinking I heard water dripping or faint scratching at the walls. My stomach twisted in knots. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke to the sound of the front door rattling. It was dawn. Pale light seeped through the windows, and the door handle shook as if something was testing it from outside. My heart drummed in my chest. I called out, "Who's there?" No one replied. I grabbed my bag and threw my laptop, notes, and clothes into it. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I just wanted to leave. I cracked the door open. The porch was littered with half-dried seaweed, and the stench made me gag. I kicked some of it aside and ran to my car. My hands fumbled with the keys. My eyes darted around, expecting that hunched figure to appear. Finally, I started the engine and sped away, my tires kicking up sand and shells. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, I noticed my body was shaking. I parked and tried to steady my breathing. I checked the time. Barely 6:30 in the morning. The gas station clerk gave me a puzzled look as I stumbled in to buy water. I probably looked unhinged. I took a moment to calm down before driving the rest of the way back. My phone had no missed calls or texts. The property manager didn't attempt to contact me, and I didn't reach out to him. I just wanted to forget. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me. I'd hear a quiet dripping noise at night, but I might have imagined it. I had nightmares about fish bones and that scaly figure. Sometimes I woke up covered in sweat, convinced I smelled rotten fish. I tried telling a close friend what happened, but I left out the part about the creature. I just said the cabin was in bad shape, that it smelled awful, and that I felt unsafe. They told me I did the right thing by leaving. It's been weeks since then, and I still feel uneasy when I see images of the ocean. I deleted the few pictures I'd taken near the cabin, especially the shot of those fish bones arranged in a circle. I don't want any reminders. Some nights, I dream of that fisherman's face, smiling in the photograph, only now twisted by the same scaly appearance I saw outside my window. I wake up with my heart pounding, short of breath. I won't go back to Myrtle Beach anytime soon. I didn't finish my manuscript during my stay there, and I don't care. I'd rather write from a crowded coffee shop than risk that sort of isolation again. Whatever was lurking near that old fisherman's cabin, I want no part of it. I still wonder if it was once a normal person who made a terrible deal, or if it's something else entirely. Either way, I'm done chasing cheap rentals in places with strange histories. I'd rather stay somewhere predictable than face those wet footprints or that suffocating stench again. If anyone asks me about that cabin, I tell them to avoid it. They might laugh it off, but I know I'm not going near that stretch of beach again. I've had enough. I first noticed the bar while wandering down a quiet side street in Nashville. I was a new musician in the city, looking for small venues where I could play. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and most people were headed to the well-known spots downtown. I wanted something different. The bar's sign was dark, without any neon lights. The building looked old, with chipped paint on the door and a rusted handle. It drew me in because every other place on that block was closed or boarded up. I felt an odd pull, as if the bar was calling me. I went inside, expecting maybe a handful of locals drinking in silence. Instead, I found a nearly empty space, lit by a few overhead bulbs that flickered now and then. The interior smelled of stale smoke. A jukebox sat in the far corner, and there was a small stage to the left. The bar counter stretched along the back wall. 4 or 5 customers sat on stools or at scattered tables. They looked worn down, tired. No one glanced at me. They all focused on their drinks or the floor. I approached the counter. The bartender was an older man with a slack expression. He barely acknowledged me. I cleared my throat and asked for a whiskey. He turned, grabbed a bottle, and poured me a small glass. His movements were slow, almost mechanical. I thanked him, but he said nothing. When I looked at him more closely, his face appeared washed out. I decided not to comment or ask questions. Maybe he was having a rough night. As I sipped my drink, I noticed the guitar on the wall behind the bar. It was covered in scribbles, possibly signatures. I recognized a couple of names belonging to famous country musicians from decades earlier. The guitar looked old. I wanted to ask how it ended up there, but the bartender seemed distant, so I stayed quiet. I decided to take a seat at a corner table, hoping to rest for a moment. The other patrons kept to themselves. A woman in a dark coat stared into her glass, not drinking. A man with a worn hat tapped his fingers on the table in a slow, uneven rhythm. Another patron sat by the wall, hunched over, as if asleep. The place felt heavy, like the air carried more weight than usual. I leaned back and tried to relax. After a few minutes, the jukebox came to life on its own. Nobody moved to select a song, but the machine lit up, and a scratchy blues tune started playing. The singer's voice sounded raw, pained. It echoed across the room, even though the jukebox's volume was low. I looked around, expecting some reaction from the others. They all seemed to freeze in place, as if the music held them in a spell. The bartender halted mid-motion while wiping a glass. I felt a chill in my arms. My heartbeat sped up, though I couldn't explain why. Something about that song made the back of my neck tingle. The voice sounded old and distant, like it was coming from another time. As the guitar line kicked in, I realized I had never heard this exact track before. It was a familiar style of blues, but the melody shifted in unusual ways. I tried to catch the lyrics, but they seemed garbled, like the words were slurring together. Suddenly, one of the customers stood up. He moved past my table in a smooth glide. I didn't see his feet move, and yet he crossed the room in seconds. A gust of cool air hit me as he passed. My chest felt tight, and I noticed that his footsteps didn't make any sound. I blinked, thinking I must be tired, but I knew something was off. He reached the door and walked out, never glancing back. The door swung shut with a soft click. I glanced at the bartender, hoping for some sign of normalcy. He resumed wiping the glass, ignoring what had just happened. I swallowed hard and looked at the remaining patrons. They hadn't changed their expressions. The man in the hat continued tapping. The woman in the coat stared straight ahead. The jukebox played on, cycling through that same moaning blues voice. I stood up, feeling uneasy. I walked closer to the jukebox. The front panel was scratched, and the song selection buttons looked worn. I didn't see any record or digital display listing the current song. The labels appeared faded and didn't match the tune that was playing. I tapped a few buttons, but nothing changed. The music continued, unbroken, as if the machine was stuck in some loop. While I stood there, I heard a sharp inhalation behind me. I turned and saw the man in the hat rising from his seat. He approached me with slow steps. My heart pounded. His eyes looked distant, almost cloudy. He spoke in a soft, wavering voice. "Don't mess with that." His words gave me a start, because he looked more solid up close, but his voice sounded hollow. I asked him, "What is this song?" He just shook his head and said, "You should leave." I felt a tightness in my stomach. I moved away from the jukebox, giving the man room. He went back to his table and sat down, resuming his tapping. I realized the bartender was watching me now. His gaze seemed more alert, but his face remained colorless. I took a few steps toward the bar and noticed that his outline seemed dim at the edges, as if he wasn't entirely solid. My mouth went dry. I tried to convince myself it was the poor lighting or my imagination. Still, I felt tension in every muscle. Before I could say anything, the lights flickered overhead. The jukebox cut out for a second, then started again with the same track, but slightly louder. The singer's voice had a new edge to it, almost a growl. I took a step back, my pulse throbbing in my temples. I felt the urge to run for the door, but I couldn't move. I wanted to speak, but my throat felt closed. The bartender opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. Then the overhead bulbs dimmed to a faint glow. The entire bar seemed to shift, like the walls and floor wavered in place. The chairs around me flickered, momentarily looking broken or covered in dust, then snapping back to their previous appearance. I saw a layer of cobwebs on the ceiling beams that vanished just as quickly. It was as if the place was caught between two states, one decaying and empty, the other just barely functional. I stumbled toward the door, finally breaking free of that frozen feeling. My heart pounded, and my breaths came short and fast. As I reached the handle, I glanced over my shoulder. The bartender and customers seemed faded, like old photographs. The woman in the coat looked straight at me, her eyes wide, her face tense. The man in the hat reached out, but I wasn't sure if he was beckoning me back or warning me away. The jukebox wailed louder, the guitar notes clashing. I tried to pull the door, but it felt stuck. My palms were damp with sweat. I yanked it harder. For a moment it refused to budge. My legs trembled, and a wave of panic hit me. Then it gave way. The door opened onto the dark street. I stepped outside, my heart racing. I slammed the door behind me, chest heaving with relief. The moment I stood on the sidewalk, everything went quiet. The road was nearly empty. A few streetlights flickered. I turned around to look at the bar again. The sign above the entrance was half broken, the letters barely readable. Through the window, I saw only darkness. It looked abandoned. My hands shook as I gripped the door handle again, wanting to confirm what I was seeing. The door was locked, and the interior appeared empty. Dust coated the window, and I saw cobwebs clinging to the corners of the glass. It was as if I'd stumbled out of a place that no longer existed. I backed away, breathing hard. My shirt clung to my back. I walked quickly down the sidewalk, checking over my shoulder every few steps. I felt uncertain, almost disoriented. The sound of that blues track still echoed in my mind. I could recall every note, every tremor in the singer's voice. My skin tingled, and I couldn't calm my racing thoughts. I got back to my small apartment around 1 a.m. I locked the door and turned on every light. My heart rate stayed high for a while. I paced the living room, replaying the events in my head. I wondered if I'd had some kind of hallucination, but it felt too real. I remembered the chill in the air, the stale smoke smell, the bartender's distant gaze, and that ghostly way the man in the hat moved across the floor. For weeks, I told no one. I was afraid people would mock me or question my sanity. Eventually, I mentioned it to a fellow musician, someone who'd been in Nashville a long time. He eyed me carefully and said I wasn't the first to bring up a bar that vanished off a side street. He claimed he'd heard rumors of a place frequented by musicians who died decades ago, a kind of spectral hangout. He wasn't sure if any of it was true. Still, his reaction gave me a chill. I tried to find that street again, but it never looked the same in daylight. I walked up and down the block, checking every old building. None matched the bar's exterior. The one that came close had a boarded-up door and no sign. The windows were broken, and the inside appeared gutted. No jukebox, no counter, no trace of life. I felt confused. My stomach twisted whenever I passed it. I thought about returning at night, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I still recall how the place seemed stuck between two versions of itself, one that still operated for a few lonely souls, and one that had been abandoned for years. Now, every time I think about it, that blues tune rings in my head. I can almost hear the guitar's sorrowful chords. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear it drifting through my window. I avoid that side street now. Part of me wants to go back and face whatever that was, but my instincts tell me not to. I can't shake the memory of the bartender's pale features and those silent footsteps of the patron who brushed past me. When I think of Nashville nightlife, I no longer picture bright neon signs and loud music. I think of that empty bar, a place that may not exist in the normal sense. It felt like a trap or a gateway. I still have no solid explanation for what happened. I know it was real in the moment, even if my mind struggles to make sense of it now. The fear I felt was raw and immediate. The quiet tension in that room was unlike anything I've experienced before. If someone ever asks me if I believe in ghosts, I can't give a simple yes or no. I only have this story, one night in Nashville, stumbling into a place that seemed both dead and alive, surrounded by spirits who listened to a blues track they couldn't escape. And I'm glad I got out when I did. I decided to visit the old railroad station in Hartford because I've always had a soft spot for abandoned places. My name is Liam, and I'm fascinated by the history of trains. I collect old timetables, railway memorabilia, and photos of closed lines. So when I heard there was a disused station left to decay on the outskirts of the city, I couldn't resist. I arranged a day off from work and drove out there with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. I wanted to document everything: the architecture, the condition of the tracks, and any leftover signs or schedules. The station stood behind a rusted chain-link fence with multiple "no trespassing" signs. The main building had chipped paint, smashed windows, and a sagging roof. There was a wide platform out front, littered with leaves and small branches. The tracks extended on either side, but I knew that no train had come through for many years. It looked lifeless. I made my way through a gap in the fence, trying not to tear my jacket on the bent wires. The ground felt soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of dead leaves. I heard them crunch with each step. The wind was gentle, but there was a chill in the air. The sun was still up, but the sky was gray, giving everything a dull tone. I walked around the building, snapping pictures of the broken windows and the graffiti on the walls. Then I approached the main doors, which had been boarded up. One of the boards was loose, so I pried it back enough to squeeze inside. Immediately I smelled dust and mildew. The old ticket counter stood on one side, the glass shattered. The waiting area had wooden benches covered in a layer of grime. Pieces of plaster littered the floor from the ceiling above. I could hear a faint dripping sound, water maybe, from a crack in the roof. I turned on my flashlight. Its beam lit up drifting dust motes in the stale air. Something about the place felt heavy. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the layout. I took photos of the benches and the ticket booth, carefully stepping around broken glass. Every so often, I stopped to listen. I thought I heard a faint echo, like footsteps in a distant hallway, but I reminded myself that old buildings can create weird echoes. After exploring the lobby, I followed a corridor that led to the offices and maintenance rooms. Everything was in disarray, files scattered, broken chairs, and walls covered with graffiti. The corridor was dim. Light filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, giving just enough illumination to see. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled. It was a soft hiss, like static. I froze in place, shining my flashlight upward. There was no power to this building. I saw a row of old speakers near the ceiling, connected to wires that hung loose. My heart started pounding. The static lasted a few seconds, then stopped. The corridor fell silent again. I swallowed hard and told myself it might have been something shifting in the walls. I forced myself to move on. The corridor opened into a large hall that led onto the platform. I could see the outside light leaking in from the far doors. I decided to check the platform next, figuring I'd save the rest of the building for later. As I reached the door, something in the corner of my eye made me turn. An old speaker was mounted above me, exactly like the ones in the corridor. I swear I saw a flicker of light along the wire, but it vanished so quickly that I wondered if it was my imagination. Stepping onto the platform, I felt a slight breeze. The sun was dipping behind the city skyline, creating long shadows. I checked the time on my phone. Early evening. I realized I'd spent more time inside than I intended. Still, I wanted a few more photos. The platform was covered in dead leaves, scraps of paper, and random debris. One of the benches was missing a leg, slanted at an angle. I walked to the edge, where the tracks should be. They were still there, rusty, with weeds growing through the ties. I stepped carefully. The air felt colder as the sun disappeared further. I snapped some pictures, then knelt to inspect the rails. That's when a faint buzzing came from the old station speakers. My ears picked up a garbled voice, like an announcement trying to break through static. I stood up, adrenaline kicking in. The voice was unintelligible, but it repeated a few times before cutting off. My heart was pounding. I looked back at the station. Darkness was settling in, and only a bit of light was left in the sky. I decided maybe I should leave, but a part of me wanted to see if the speakers would crackle again. I inched closer to the covered walkway that led to the second platform across the tracks. Suddenly, the overhead lights on the platform blinked once. They didn't fully illuminate, just one brief flicker. My flashlight began to sputter. I smacked it with my palm and the beam steadied again, but I felt shaken. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the distant rumble of a train. It started softly, a faint vibration underfoot, but it grew stronger, like a locomotive was approaching. I glanced up the line. The tracks led into darkness, no sign of any train or lights. Yet the rumble intensified. The station speakers came to life, crackling. A distorted voice announced, "Train arriving on track 2." The words were garbled, repeated twice. My pulse slammed in my ears. This station was closed, so no real train could be coming. Still, I felt compelled to step toward the edge and peer down the track. My breath came in short gasps. In the distance, I saw a glow, dim at first. It flickered like headlights or an old lantern. Then it grew larger, resembling a row of train windows. I felt a wave of confusion and fear. The station floor vibrated slightly, as if heavy machinery was approaching. I stood rigid, unable to move, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The lights slowed and pulled up next to the platform, except I couldn't see a solid train. Instead, there was a grayish shape, almost translucent. It had the outline of a locomotive and a few cars behind it. It made no actual noise except for a faint hiss of air. A ghostly door hissed open, revealing a silhouette of people inside. I swear I saw shapes moving, like passengers shifting in their seats. I held my breath, heart hammering. Then shadows stepped onto the platform, dragging what looked like suitcases or bags. They had no color, just shades of gray, like old photographs. I stood there, frozen. They seemed unaware of me, or uninterested. A woman in a tattered dress, a man in a suit holding a hat, a child clutching a small bag. They moved in slow motion, barely making a sound. It was as if their footsteps were muffled. I felt a sudden urge to speak, but nothing came out. My hands trembled, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. My mouth was dry, and I realized I was shaking. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The shadowy passengers walked past me. Some had faces that were blurred, while others looked more defined, showing expressions of weariness. One woman seemed to catch my eye for a split second. I saw confusion in her features, as if she was lost. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the lights from the ghostly train started fading. I heard a faint horn blast, distant and echoing. The silhouettes boarded again, or maybe they vanished. My eyes were locked on the shape of the train as it pulled away. dissolving into darkness down the track. The station speakers crackled once more, then fell silent. The platform was empty, leaving me with the cold evening air and my racing heartbeat. I realized my flashlight had gone out completely, leaving me standing in near darkness. I struggled to breathe, my chest tight. I turned around, stumbling back toward the station building. My foot caught on a loose board, and I nearly fell. I reached the corridor entrance, moving as fast as I could without tripping. Inside, I fumbled for my phone to use its light. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped it. I shoved my way through the broken door and out into the open air. Once I reached the fence, I squeezed through the gap. I didn't stop until I was at my car. My entire body felt tense, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. I slid into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, my heart still hammering. Then I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. That night, I barely slept. I replayed the scene in my mind, questioning my sanity. Could it have been a trick of the light? Some elaborate prank? But the images were so vivid. The shadowy train, the passengers, the station speakers announcing its arrival. I remembered the trembling beneath my feet. The next day, I tried to find historical records. I discovered that in 1923, there had been a fatal accident involving a night train that derailed just beyond the station. Many passengers lost their lives. Some articles mentioned that people occasionally claimed to see a phantom train pulling in at night, reenacting the final stop that never should have happened. I never returned to that station. My curiosity warred with my fear, but fear won. I kept the photos I took inside the building, though none showed anything supernatural. They were just shots of empty benches and broken windows. I told a close friend, who shrugged it off as a scary story. But I know what I saw. I felt the vibrations and heard the announcement. I saw the shapes of men, women, and a child, all gray as ash. Sometimes, late at night, I hear an echo in my mind, the muffled screech of brakes and a soft voice on the speakers saying, "Train arriving on track 2. I still collect railway items. I still visit old stations, but not that one. I can't shake the memory of those silent passengers stepping onto the platform. There's a lingering heaviness in my chest when I think about it, like I can't fully breathe. I've decided that place is better left alone. Whatever happened in 1923 left an imprint there, and I stumbled right into it. The phantom train completed its arrival, and I saw people who never reached their intended stop. That's a sight I'll never forget, no matter how many times I try to convince myself it was all in my head. Now, whenever I pass through Hartford, I feel a pang of anxiety, but I make sure to stay well away from that abandoned station. I'm not looking for a second encounter with that haunted platform. I was going through my usual routine at the small historical museum in Richmond when I received a peculiar shipment. My name is Catherine, and I work as an archivist. I handle old documents, artifacts, and the odd relic that people donate. Usually these items arrive with a short description, a rough date, and maybe some family history. On that particular morning, our front desk clerk wheeled in a large padded box addressed to me. It had no return label, just an inscription on the top. Estate donation, relic. I took the box to our back office, which is where I catalog incoming objects. Our museum is small, so I work alone most of the time. We don't have large crowds or busy staff. It's just a quiet place with a few dedicated people. I set the box on a table under bright fluorescent lights and carefully opened the flaps. Inside, I found a wooden case wrapped in layers of bubble wrap. The case was about the size of a thick book, made of dark wood with metal inlays. The front latch was elaborate, gold and silver filigree shaped into twisting patterns. I noticed small images carved into the wood, angels and horned figures interlaced in a way that caught my eye immediately. A note accompanied the case. It read, "Found in an old Richmond estate, possibly European origin, 17th century. Family rumored to have ties to witchcraft accusations." The handwriting was shaky, and there was no signature. I felt a prickle of excitement, but also wariness. We get strange items sometimes, old diaries, weathered paintings, but this relic had a different energy. I use the word energy loosely, but I mean it gave me a heavy feeling in my chest. The hair on my arms stood up just touching it. I brought the wooden case to my workstation. The front latch was locked, and there was no key in sight. I tried to examine the metal, hoping to see a name or date. I just found more carvings, some shaped like angels, others like demons. I noted the weight of the piece in my log, about 3 pounds. The label relic suggests it might contain a religious or personal artifact. I decided to see if I could carefully open it with small tools. I've picked old locks before, though I'm not an expert. As I sat there, leaning over the relic, I started to feel a pressure in my ears. It reminded me of being underwater or on an airplane. The office was quiet, and no one else was around. I began to work on the latch with a thin set of archive tools, a tiny flathead screwdriver and a narrow pick. The metal creaked under the gentle force. After a few tries, I felt the latch give a little. That's when I heard the first sound. It was a soft whisper, like a breath inside the wooden case. I paused, my heart pounding. The whisper repeated, a faint susurration that I couldn't place. I looked around to see if the HVAC system had turned on or if a draft was hitting something. The vents were silent. The overhead lights hummed faintly, but that wasn't the same sound. My throat went dry. I told myself it might be air escaping from somewhere in the old wood, but I felt uneasy. Still, I resumed my work on the latch. It clicked open with a small snap. At that exact moment, the whisper grew louder. It sounded like voices speaking a language I didn't recognize, maybe Latin or something similar. The words were short and repeated in a low, rhythmic way. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I slowly removed my tools and touched the lid. The whispering seemed to come from inside. I pulled the lid open an inch. The hinges complained with a high-pitched squeak. I peered inside and saw a small folded piece of stained fabric and a lock of pale hair tied with a thin thread. I stared in confusion. It looked like human hair. A musty smell wafted out, like old paper and dried herbs, but with a sour undertone. The whispering grew more distinct. My scalp prickled, and I felt a chill along my arms. I leaned in closer, shining a desk lamp on the relic's contents. The piece of fabric had dark patches. I couldn't tell if it was dried blood or mold. My mind jumped to the note about witchcraft accusations. I felt a tug in my stomach, a mix of revulsion and curiosity. I reached for my phone to record a short video, thinking the audio might pick up the whisper. Before I could start, the overhead lights flickered. A sharp gust of cold air brushed against the back of my neck. It startled me so much that I almost dropped my phone. I checked the thermostat. It read the normal temperature, and the vents were still. The whispers shifted in tone, sounding more like a low chant. I decided to close the relic. I placed the hair back inside, folded the fabric as best I could, and tried to lower the lid. But the chant became louder. I felt pressure in my sinuses and a ringing in my ears. My hands shook, and I forced myself to breathe calmly. Finally, I managed to shut the lid. The moment it closed, the whispering dropped to a faint murmur, then stopped. My shoulders felt stiff, and I realized I'd been tensing my muscles the entire time. I needed to secure this relic, so I grabbed an archival box and placed the wooden case inside. Then I locked the box in a storage cabinet. My heart still thumped heavily, and my palms were damp. I stepped out of the back office and went to find my supervisor, but he was out for the day. We're a small staff, so I couldn't share what happened with anyone. I decided I would email him, but I hesitated because I didn't want to sound delusional. Instead, I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and tried to calm down. Later that afternoon, while I was cataloging other items, I heard a door creak. I turned around, expecting to see a coworker. The corridor was empty. Then I noticed a slight movement in my peripheral vision, near the office door. It looked like a small figure with a hood or cowl covering its face. It was standing by the threshold. My stomach lurched, and I felt my chest tighten. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. I rushed to the hall, but there was nobody there. The corridor was silent. My breathing turned shallow. I tried telling myself it was a shadow or a trick of the light. I stayed in the front area for the rest of the day, avoiding the back office. Around closing time, the lights in the building dimmed again. I jumped, feeling a surge of panic. One of the other staff members said it was probably a minor electrical glitch. I nodded, trying to hide how unsettled I felt. Once everyone left, I debated whether to open the relic again or to leave it locked up. I decided it was safer in the cabinet. That night, I dreamed I was back in the office, kneeling in front of the relic. In the dream, the case was wide open, and the whispering was all around me, pressing in on my ears. Then I saw that same hooded figure standing behind me, but it was leaning forward as if peering over my shoulder. I bolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering. I tried to shake off the dream, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I arrived early, hoping to do more research on the relic. I searched our archives for any mention of a family with witchcraft allegations. I found a file about a 17th century aristocratic family rumored to practice dark rites. There was a line referencing a relic box containing a lock of hair from a young victim. My skin crawled reading that. It suggested the hair belonged to someone who died under suspicious circumstances. The text also mentioned that the relic was believed to hold a trapped spirit or a curse. I felt a knot in my stomach. I went to the storage cabinet to check on the relic, half expecting it to be missing. It was still there, sealed in the archival box. I decided not to open it again. I just wanted to record it as a dangerous artifact and place it in deeper storage. But as I grabbed the box, the overhead lights flickered once more. A faint whisper emanated from inside the cabinet, muffled yet distinct. My fingers tingled with pins and needles. I hurried to the main hall, carrying the box at arm's length. I placed it on a rolling cart and headed for the climate-controlled vault, where high-security items are kept. On the way, the whisper rose in pitch. It sounded like someone pleading, though I couldn't recognize the language. My gut clenched, and I nearly dropped the box. When I finally reached the vault, I unlocked one of the larger metal cabinets, slid the relic box inside, and shut the heavy door. I locked it with a key and a numeric code, then stepped back, breathing hard. The whisper faded. The corridor returned to silence. My shoulders ached from tension. I stood there for a minute, struggling to regain my composure. Then I heard a faint tapping on the metal cabinet door. It was soft but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My throat tightened, and I felt goosebumps all over. I backed away, left the vault, and locked that door too. At that point, I decided I had done all I could. The relic was contained. I would inform my supervisor that it needed special handling, maybe even removal from the museum. I wrote a brief report stating that the relic was believed to have historical significance but posed potential hazards. I left out the personal experiences, focusing on the documented claims of witchcraft. That evening, I checked the security cameras out of curiosity. The footage in the vault hallway showed me wheeling the cart in, storing the box, and then leaving. After I walked away, the camera flickered. For about 2 seconds, the screen went grainy, but I thought I saw a small, dark shape near the cabinet. Then the feed returned to normal. I replayed it several times, but the shape was too distorted to identify. My mouth went dry. I haven't opened the relic since then. As far as I know, my supervisor never did either. We wrapped it in additional protective materials and placed it in the farthest corner of the vault. I avoid that area when I can. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I tell myself it's my nerves. Late at night, I still remember the chant, the faint voice that grew louder the moment I unlatched the box. I can't forget the pressure I felt in the room, as if the air thickened and pushed back against me. I share this story reluctantly because it sounds unbelievable, but I felt every moment of it. I still get that uneasy feeling if I walk by the vault. I keep imagining the hooded figure standing there waiting. Maybe the relic is harmless unless someone opens it again. Or maybe it's doing something else behind that locked metal door. Either way, I'm not going to break that seal. Once was enough for me. And if anyone else ever tries, I hope they're prepared for the whispers and the shape in the corridor. I'm certainly not. I took my motorcycle on a long road trip because I wanted a quiet route and some fresh scenery. My name is Garrett, and I enjoy riding through open highways where I can clear my head. That's why I chose a back road near Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was supposed to be scenic and calm, with rolling plains and few cars. At first, the day was clear and the ride felt smooth. But as evening approached, the weather shifted. A heavy fog rolled in, odd for that region at that time of year. My GPS began to glitch, showing a blank screen or an error message. I tried restarting it, but it kept losing my location. My cell phone had no signal out there, so I couldn't check a map. I decided to keep going, hoping the road would lead me to a town or at least a landmark. The pavement stretched in front of me, gray and empty. There were no other vehicles, and the fog made everything appear ghostly. The quietness started to get under my skin. After what felt like an hour, I saw a faint glow in the distance on the right side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a flickering motel sign. The letters looked half burned out and read something like VAC NCY. Though the rest was too faded to read properly. I felt a sense of relief, thinking I might rest for the night and figure out my route in the morning. I turned into the dirt parking area, noticing no other cars. The motel looked old, with cracked walls and peeling paint. A single light flickered above the entrance. I parked my motorcycle near the main office door. The place was quiet. I wondered if the motel was abandoned, but the sign was glowing enough to suggest there might be power. The office door stood partly open, squeaking when the wind blew. I walked inside, expecting to see a front desk or maybe a bell to ring. Instead, I found a small foyer with outdated wallpaper curling at the edges. A counter stood in the back, and I saw a tattered guest book on top. There was no one around, so I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" No response came, just the sound of the wind rattling the door. I looked around the office, noticing an old chair with a torn cushion. The air smelled musty, like damp carpet and mold. Behind the counter, I saw a key rack with a row of old-fashioned metal room keys. The date on a yellowed calendar behind the counter read something from the 1980s. At that moment, my nerves started prickling. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. Yet I convinced myself it might still function as an old roadside motel that never modernized. Feeling uneasy, I took one of the room keys labeled Room 6. I figured if the staff was absent, I could at least find a room, leave some money behind, and then sort it out in the morning. The building's corridor was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered. The hallway smelled stale. My footsteps sounded too loud, echoing off the neglected walls. When I reached room 6, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft creak. I switched on the light, which cast a weak glow around the space. The bed was covered in a thin spread, worn and faded. A small nightstand with a lamp stood beside it, and a chipped dresser leaned against the opposite wall. The carpet had stains that looked decades old, but at least it was a place to rest. I shut the door, feeling the latch click behind me, and set my backpack on the dresser. I tried the bathroom light and heard the hum of an old exhaust fan. The sink dripped. Everything looked aged but functional enough for one night. My stomach growled, and I regretted not stopping for food earlier. I rummaged through my pack, found a protein bar, and ate it while sitting on the edge of the bed. The sheets had a stale smell, but I told myself it was better than sleeping outside in the fog. An hour later, as I lay down, I heard footsteps in the corridor. They had a slow, unsteady rhythm, like someone limping or dragging a foot. I sat upright, listening. The footsteps paused near my door. I expected a knock, but none came. Then the sound faded. My hair stood on end. The motel had felt deserted, so hearing anyone else there made me jumpy. I decided to check the hallway. I opened the door a crack, peering out. The corridor was empty, the single bulb still flickering. I stepped out, calling softly, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. Only the hum of the overhead light. My unease grew. I returned to my room and locked the door. Later that night, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard soft laughter. It sounded like multiple people, as if a small gathering was happening somewhere in the building. The voices were faint, muffled, almost cheerful. I checked the time on my phone, no signal, and it was past midnight. My shoulders tensed. Where were these people, and why hadn't I seen them? I put on my shoes, grabbed my flashlight, and decided to investigate. Following the sound led me to what seemed like a dining area or lounge in the back of the motel. The door to that space was slightly ajar, and I saw a faint glow inside. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open, shining my flashlight around. The tables were set with dusty dishes, and chairs were arranged as if expecting guests, but no one was present. A musty odor filled the air, and the dim overhead light revealed cobwebs in the corners. Yet I could still hear low chatter, like laughter from another room. I stepped around a table, my flashlight beam revealing place settings that looked untouched for years. The chairs creaked softly on their own, as if moved by a breeze I couldn't feel. A sudden chill ran up my spine. I realized the laughter wasn't actually in this room. It sounded more like it was behind the walls or echoing through old speakers. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I backed away, deciding this was too unsettling. I wanted to get back to my room, pack my things, and leave immediately. But the fog still enveloped everything outside, and I had no idea how far the next town was. Returning to my room, I smelled something smoky, like burnt wood or plastic. I paused. The corridor was dark, except for that weak light overhead. I saw no sign of fire, but the odor persisted. I felt a spike of fear, picturing an electrical short. I reached for my door handle and heard a sudden knock from behind me. 3 loud raps on the wall. I whirled around, shining the flashlight, but nobody was there. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it in my throat. I got into my room and locked the door again, sliding the chain across for good measure. I paced for a moment, debating whether to leave right then, but the thought of riding through heavy fog on a deserted highway terrified me more. I sat on the bed, my heart racing. Then came another noise, soft laughter, but this time it seemed to come from above me, like the floor above, except this was a single-story motel. The laughter died down, replaced by a faint crackling sound, as though a distant fire burned somewhere. My mouth went dry. I knew I couldn't stay until morning, not with these sounds and the sense that something was wrong. I stuffed my belongings back into my backpack, grabbed my keys, and hurried out to the parking lot. The air felt thicker, and the fog clung to my face. The sign above the motel blinked irregularly. My motorcycle was still there, covered in a thin layer of moisture. I fumbled with the ignition, trying to steady my trembling hands. As I revved the engine, I glanced back at the motel. The front office stood in darkness. The sign flickered once more, then went out completely, leaving only the faint glow of my bike's headlight. I backed out of the parking area and turned onto the highway. The fog swallowed everything. My visibility was low, but I had to leave. The tension in my chest wouldn't let me stay another minute. I rode slowly, scanning for anything familiar. After a few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was no longer visible, lost in the swirling mist. Suddenly, the fog lifted, as if a curtain had been pulled back. The road was clear, and I saw open plains under a cloudy night sky. No trace of heavy mist remained. I kept riding, confused but relieved. Within half an hour, I reached a small gas station. Its lights were bright, and the parking lot looked normal. I pulled in and parked, feeling a wave of relief. The clerk inside seemed friendly. I asked if there was a motel nearby. He said the nearest one was another 20 miles down the road. I described the old place I'd just left. He gave me a strange look and said that motel had burned down in the 80s, killing several guests. There was nothing left but ruins. I insisted I'd just stayed there, and he shook his head, looking concerned or maybe thinking I was joking. I left the station with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I drove to a chain motel in the next town, where I finally booked a room. The next morning, I tried to find information about that old motel. Online references matched the clerk's story. It had burned, and nobody rebuilt it. Some people claimed it reappeared on foggy nights, trapping travelers who lost their way. I sat on the bed, reading and feeling a cold knot form in my chest. My thoughts went back to the quiet corridor, the musty smell, and the echoing laughter. It was all so real. I remembered the dusty dishes in the lounge, the flickering sign, and the missing staff. I still don't have a proper explanation. I can't dismiss what I saw and heard. Whenever someone asks about strange road stories, I mention the haunted motel I stumbled upon near Cheyenne. Most people think I'm exaggerating or mixing up details, but I know what happened. The memory of those old tables and the drifting laughter remains vivid. I'm convinced I walked into a place that shouldn't exist anymore, a trapped moment in time. These days, I try to avoid driving long stretches of deserted highways after dusk. I also keep a paper map with me in case my GPS fails. I don't want to rely on electronics alone. The road in Wyoming taught me that sometimes you come across things you can't explain. I just hope I don't stumble on any more lost motels that never should have returned. If I do, I'll remember to leave at once, and I'll double-check that I'm not just riding into a memory of something that burned to the ground decades ago. I remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong with that old iron bridge in Rochester. It was early spring, just after sunset. I was strolling across it like I had done so many times before. I enjoyed the quiet view of the river below, which always gave me a sense of peace after a busy day. I leaned against the metal railing, feeling the cold press through my jacket. Then I heard what sounded like someone calling out, but the voice was faint and distant. I assumed it was a late jogger on the path below. I looked around, saw no one, and shrugged it off. But the voice came again, a muffled cry from under the bridge. That second time, I felt a flutter of unease in my stomach. My hands tensed on the railing. I leaned forward, trying to see if someone was stuck on the embankment. The sky had grown dim, so visibility was poor. I walked to the far end of the bridge and took the steps down to the riverbank. The path was damp, and my shoes made soft, squishing sounds on the earth. I called out, "Hello? Is anybody there?" The only response was the rush of water moving along the river. I checked the underside of the bridge as best I could. The beams were rusty, and it was hard to see into the shadows. I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. My pulse thumped, and I sensed I was alone, though that didn't calm my nerves. I returned to the top of the bridge, scanning for any clue that someone might need help. I saw no person on the walkway. The streetlights were too far to illuminate everything clearly, but I could still make out silhouettes if anyone was nearby. Nothing moved. I considered calling the police, but I wasn't sure how to explain. I heard a faint cry under a bridge, yet saw no sign of trouble. I decided I might have imagined it. That possibility let me leave with less dread. I walked back home, trying to forget the sound, but my mind played it on a loop. The next day, I tried to put it out of my head. I focused on work, telling myself it was probably an echo or a trick of the wind. That evening, though, my curiosity got the best of me. Around dusk, I found myself heading back to the same bridge. The sun was just setting, and the sky had a reddish tint. The river below looked calm, reflecting the last light of day. I gripped the railing and listened. Everything seemed normal. The traffic on the nearby street buzzed by. I thought maybe I'd confirm that nothing weird was happening. Then I would go home and feel settled. After a few minutes, I heard it again. This time it was softer, like a distant plea. The sound came from beneath my feet. A tingle ran through my arms, and my breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to stay calm. I walked to the center of the bridge, directly over the deepest part of the river. The metal under my shoes vibrated slightly, as though a gentle tremor passed through it. I pressed my hand on the railing, feeling a faint quiver. My heart rate spiked. I told myself that maybe trucks passing in the distance caused some vibration, but the road above was empty at that moment. I had no logical explanation. I decided to investigate the underside again. I was more prepared this time, bringing a strong flashlight. I climbed down the embankment and turned the beam upward. The rusted beams crisscrossed overhead, dripping with condensation. Shadows danced along the metal surfaces. The water lapped softly at the bank. I stood there, scanning every corner. Nothing moved, and no voice called out. I stayed for a while, my shoulders tense, my back stiff from anxiety. When I finally left, I felt drained. Over the next few days, I researched the bridge's history. I learned it dated back to the late 19th century. Locals considered it a minor landmark, but I found references to an accident decades ago, a partial collapse that caused a few people to fall into the river. Some bodies were never recovered. A few old newspaper clippings mentioned survivors' accounts of screams and confusion that night. Other stories mentioned that passers-by occasionally heard cries for help under that bridge, even when no one was there. Most folks dismissed those accounts as urban legends or misheard echoes. I kept that information in mind and returned to the bridge several more times around sunset. Each time I heard faint voices. Sometimes they sounded like cries, other times more like a single word. I couldn't piece together the meaning, but it sent shivers through me. I wondered if it was just the acoustics of the area. Rivers can carry sounds in odd ways, especially under old iron bridges. But the effect it had on me was too strong to ignore. One night, I decided to record these sounds with my phone. I hoped to confirm they existed outside my imagination. I stood near the center of the bridge, phone in hand, my fingers trembling slightly. The wind was mild, the water below steady. I waited, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. Eventually, the sound came, a low moan that rose and then faded. I hit record, pointing the phone toward the water. After about 15 minutes, I stopped. Listening to the playback in my earbuds, I mostly heard the river's flow. But at around 10 seconds, there was a faint murmur that didn't match the water. I played it back repeatedly, my skin tingling. It was a raspy whisper, almost like a name. It was too garbled to be certain. Still, it gave me a surge of dread. I kept returning to the spot, always near dusk or shortly after. I felt compelled to figure out what I was hearing. On one of these visits, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the bridge railing. The silhouette looked like a person leaning over. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. My footsteps clanged on the metal as I hurried closer. That shape remained in place, unmoving, until I was about 10 feet away. Then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. My heart pounded, and a wave of cold sweat soaked my back. I reached the section where I'd seen the figure. The metal railing was damp. There were no footprints on the walkway. I felt dizzy. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, or maybe someone stepped away quickly. But the way it disappeared felt unnatural. Another night, I visited with a friend who was skeptical of my stories. She stood by me on the bridge for a solid hour. Nothing happened. No voices, no figures. The river stayed quiet, the metal silent. She patted me on the shoulder, saying I probably needed a break or had an overactive imagination. I felt foolish. But when I returned alone a few days later, the sounds came back. This time they were louder, almost urgent. The immediate reaction in my body was a tightness in my chest and tingling in my scalp. My eyes watered. I called out again, feeling desperate for answers. The echoes faded, leaving me shaken. I started noticing small details I'd missed before, tiny droplets of water along the railing, even when it hadn't rained. A faint odor of algae near the center of the bridge, though the rest of the walkway smelled like metal and traffic fumes. At times I felt a light spray on my ankles, as if a small wave had splashed over. But the river was far below, and no car had driven by to splash water. Each occurrence left my stomach in knots. My final visit to the bridge was the one that pushed me to stop going at night. It was late autumn, and the weather was cold. The sky was clear, and the moonlight gave the water a dull shine. I stood in the middle of the bridge, scanning the darkness. A faint breeze rustled my hair. Suddenly, I noticed a figure at the railing, near the far side. The shape was pale, almost translucent. It appeared to be wearing tattered clothing that clung to its body as though soaked. My mouth went dry. I stepped forward cautiously, feeling my knees wobble. When I was about 6 feet away, the figure turned its head toward me. The face looked blurry, as if I was seeing it through fogged glass. The eyes were empty, hollow. My heart drummed, and a surge of coldness shot through my limbs. It moved its mouth, but I heard no sound. I wanted to back away, but I was rooted to the spot, arms rigid. Then, in a sudden motion, the figure opened its mouth wider, as if screaming, but no noise came out. The next instant, it faded into the night, like steam dissipating in cold air. I stood there, chest heaving, breath uneven. My skin felt clammy, and my pulse hammered at my temples. I backed away, step by step, refusing to turn my back on that spot. Once I reached the other end of the bridge, I ran. I didn't stop until I was home, locking the door behind me. Since that night, I haven't crossed the bridge after dark. I still drive over it during the day, but I avoid walking there in the evening. I've heard others mention strange experiences, faint cries or glimpses of shapes near the water. Some folks claim they felt water spray on their legs when no cars were around. A few people believe these incidents are linked to the old accident, that maybe the spirits of those who fell still linger. Others dismiss it as superstition. I can't say with certainty what I saw or heard. I only know how my body reacted each time. The tension in my muscles, the pounding in my chest, the numbness in my fingers. It wasn't my imagination. I sensed something real, something beyond explanation. The iron bridge may look ordinary under the sun, but after dark, it feels different. I believe it holds echoes of the past. I won't deny that I'm afraid of it. I don't care if people tease me for avoiding it at night. I'd rather keep my distance than experience another silent scream or see another translucent figure vanish before my eyes. I still live in Rochester. I still love the river. During the day, it's peaceful and serene. But whenever I see that old iron bridge at dusk, I feel a twist of anxiety in my gut. I think of those voices and the watery figure that locked eyes with me. I hope those trapped echoes find rest someday, but I'm not going to watch that process unfold. I've made my choice to stay away once the sun goes down. If that means missing a lovely evening view, so be it. I value my sleep and my peace of mind too much to chance another encounter.